My name is Harper. I am 28 years old and I am a payroll clerk at a mid-sized logistics firm. My parents always called me the dumb one. They made sure everyone knew it, especially while my older sister Jessica collected accolades and eventually a full ride to Harvard. On her graduation day, my father stood before a ballroom of 350 wealthy guests and proudly announced that Jessica would inherit absolutely everything. He handed her the keys to a brand new Tesla and declared she would take over our family's $13 million estate. I was sitting in the back at a dimly lit corner table, watching quietly as they completely erased my existence. I had spent years sacrificing my own comfort to fund their lavish lifestyle, believing I was saving our family from total financial ruin. But as the applause echoed through the room, a stranger in a tailored suit walked through the heavy wooden doors and approached my table. He handed me a thick envelope sealed with red wax, leaned down, and whispered that now was the time to show them who I really am. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope and how it brought my toxic family to their knees, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Growing up in our sprawling colonial house in the Chicago suburbs, I learned very quickly that love in the Sterling household was a currency, and I was completely bankrupt. Jessica was the golden child. She had the perfect grades, the effortless charm, and the unyielding attention of my parents, William and Catherine. I was just Harper, the quiet one, the one who struggled with reading comprehension in elementary school and needed extra tutoring. My mother never let me forget how much those tutors cost, constantly reminding me that I was a massive drain on their resources. Every time Jessica brought home a trophy or an academic award, my father would proudly display it on the living room mantel for every single guest to admire. When I showed them my high school diploma, my mother simply asked if I planned to move out soon so they could finally turn my bedroom into a home gym. I told myself it did not matter. I found a steady job as a payroll clerk right out of high school and moved into a cramped, leaky studio apartment across town. I worked grueling 60-hour weeks, clipping coupons and wearing clothes I bought at thrift stores. I thought physical distance would finally bring me some semblance of peace, but my family had a vicious way of pulling me back in when they needed something. The real nightmare began exactly 6 years ago, when my father called me in an absolute panic. He claimed he was drowning in massive medical debts and that our family would lose the estate entirely if I did not step up and help. The true breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening during one of my mother's mandatory family dinners. The dining room in my parents' house always felt like a museum where you were strictly forbidden to touch anything. A massive crystal chandelier cast a harsh white light over the long mahogany table, and the expensive silverware sparkled with a kind of arrogant wealth. I sat at the very far end of the table, gripping my cheap cloth napkin in my lap until my knuckles turned completely white. The air was thick with the rich smell of roasted lamb and my mother's heavy designer perfume, but all I could focus on was the knot of deep anxiety tightening in my stomach. I had just finished another grueling 10-hour shift at the payroll desk. My faded uniform blouse felt scratchy and completely out of place against the plush velvet of the dining chair. My father, William, sat at the head of the table, swirling his expensive red wine with a practiced grace. He cleared his throat loudly, and the entire room fell dead silent. "Harper!" He began, his voice carrying that familiar tone of absolute, unquestionable authority. "Your mother and I have been going over the final arrangements for Jessica's graduation party at the Plaza Hotel. It is going to be the absolute event of the season. Everyone who is anyone in our social circle will be there. We have secured the grand ballroom and the elite guest list is fully finalized." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes focused on my plate. "That sounds wonderful, Dad. I'm sure Jessica will absolutely love it. She deserves nothing but the absolute best," my mother, Catherine, chimed in from across the table. Her eyes drifted toward my older sister, Jessica, who was sitting next to me, radiating a smug, quiet confidence in a silk dress. "She has worked so incredibly hard for this Harvard degree." My father set his wine glass down with a sharp clink that made me flinch. "Exactly, which brings me to why we specifically needed you here tonight, Harper. We have run into a slight issue with the overall budget. The catering costs for 350 high society guests are significantly higher than we initially anticipated. We need you to cover the final catering invoice. It is exactly $25,000. I expect you to transfer the funds to my account by Friday morning." The entire room seemed to spin violently. I stared at him, my mind completely blank, trying to process the sheer audacity of his demand. $25,000. That was nearly my entire life savings. That was the money I had been desperately hoarding, penny by penny, clipping coupons and eating instant noodles in my drafty, leaky studio apartment just to build a tiny safety net for myself. "Dad." I started, my voice trembling so much I could barely get the words out. "I do not have that kind of money just lying around. I work as a payroll clerk. I can barely afford my own rent right now. You know I have been sending you 60% of my income to help with your medical debts." My father's face instantly hardened. His warm, authoritative facade melted away, leaving something cold and profoundly ugly behind. "Do not exaggerate, Harper. You live a very simple life. You do not have the high expenses that we do. We are asking you to step up for your family, for your sister." I looked at Jessica, desperately hoping for a shred of sisterly sympathy. Instead, she just sighed loudly and began inspecting her perfectly manicured fingernails. "It is just catering, Harper," she said dismissively. "You do not even have to pay for a dress, since you are not walking across a stage anytime soon." The casual cruelty of her words stung my eyes, but it was my mother's intervention that truly cut me down to the bone. Catherine placed her hands flat on the table, her elegant features twisting into a mask of deep, unyielding disappointment. "We should not have to sit here and beg you to support your sister Harper," my mother said, her voice dripping with pure venom. "We have sacrificed absolutely everything for this family, and it is high time you pulled your weight. You owe her this. You owe us this." "I owe you," I asked, the frustration finally bubbling up through my bone-deep exhaustion. "How do I owe you? I have given you everything I possibly can. You owe us because we spent a literal fortune trying to fix you." My mother snapped, leaning aggressively across the table. Her words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "Do not sit there and pretend you do not remember. You had those severe learning delays when you were a child. We poured thousands upon thousands of dollars into special tutors and remedial reading programs, just so you could barely scrape by in a regular public school. The letters on the pages would swim and rearrange themselves, turning simple sentences into puzzles that took you 3 times longer to solve than normal kids." My face burned with a hot, suffocating humiliation. She was weaponizing the deepest, most painful insecurities of my childhood right in front of everyone. It was true that I had struggled early on, but I had worked tirelessly to overcome it. To them, however, it was a permanent stain on my character. "You were always the slow one," my father added, his voice dripping with pure disgust. "The dumb one. We realized very early on that you were never going to amount to anything substantial. You were never going to be a visionary or a high-powered executive. You simply do not have the intellect for it." Jessica, on the other hand, was brilliant. She had real, undeniable potential. We had to make a practical choice. We had to pour our resources into the child who could actually give this family a return on investment. I sat there, completely paralyzed, as the psychological abuse rained down on me. This was their twisted justification. This was the narrative they had constructed to absolve themselves of their blatant lifelong favoritism. Because I had struggled with reading as a 7-year-old, they had entirely written off my future. They had decided I was nothing more than a worker bee, a mindless drone whose sole purpose in life was to financially support the golden child. "You should be incredibly grateful we even let you sit at this table," my mother continued, her eyes narrowing with malice. "You have a steady little blue-collar job. You do not have to worry about the immense pressure of carrying the family legacy. Jessica is going to be a powerhouse attorney. She needs this graduation party to network and secure her future. Your refusal to help is not just selfish, it is downright pathetic." The sheer injustice of it made my chest ache so badly, I could hardly breathe. For 6 years, I had lived in borderline poverty, convinced I was saving my parents from financial ruin, and they were sitting in a $13 million mansion calling me pathetic because I could not hand over another $25,000 for fancy appetizers. Before I could even gather the breath to defend myself, a deep mocking chuckle echoed from the other side of the table. It was Terrence. Terrence was Jessica's husband, an African-American corporate attorney who had recently made partner at a highly prestigious downtown law firm. He embodied modern corporate elitism in every conceivable way. He wore custom-tailored Italian suits, drove a luxury sports car, and treated anyone making less than six figures like they were utterly invisible. He had been quietly swirling his expensive bourbon, watching my humiliation like it was a free evening theater performance. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his broad chest, and looked me up and down. His gaze paused on my faded uniform blouse, and his lips curled into a deeply condescending smirk. "Come on, Harper," Terence drawled, his voice smooth and incredibly arrogant. "Why are you making such a dramatic scene over 25 grand? It is practically pocket change." I turned to look at him, my hands shaking uncontrollably in my lap. "To you maybe, Terence," I said, my voice tight and defensive, "but I work incredibly hard for my money." He laughed again, a dry sound completely devoid of any real humor. "Right, you work hard." He took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. "Let me put this in a perspective you might actually understand. I billed more hours before my lunch break today than you make in an entire year at your little payroll desk. You are sitting here crying over the cost of catering when Jessica and I are out here building a real empire. We are playing in the major leagues while you are still struggling to count pennies." Jessica beamed at him, resting her hand on his arm affectionately. "He is absolutely right, Harper. You just do not understand how the real world works. You do not understand high-level networking. This party is an investment." "An investment," Terence echoed, nodding in agreement. "And frankly, Harper, your cheap clothes and your small-minded complaints are honestly embarrassing. If you cannot contribute to the family brand, the very least you could do is write the check and stay out of the way. You are the family ATM. Just act like it." I looked around the table at the four of them, my father with his expectant, demanding glare, my mother with her deeply ingrained resentment, Jessica with her boundless entitlement, and Terence with his absolute suffocating disdain. They were a united front of cruelty and exploitation. They did not love me. They did not even respect me as a human being. I was just a walking bank account to them, a designated failure they could bleed dry to fund their own delusions of grandeur. The silence stretched out heavy and suffocating. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for me to bow my head, apologize for being difficult, and promise to transfer my life savings to them by Friday. It was the toxic pattern we had followed for my entire life. They pushed, I folded. They demanded, I paid. I stared down at my hands. They were raw and calloused from long hours of typing and filing. I thought about the drafty studio apartment I would be returning to tonight. I thought about the 6 years of my life I had given them out of pure blind loyalty. My father sighed loudly, tapping his fingers against the mahogany wood with growing impatience. "Well, Harper," he demanded sharply, "are you going to transfer the money, or are you going to prove once again that you are a complete disappointment to this family?" I sat in that dining room, looking at the remains of a catered meal that cost more than my car. They called me a disappointment. They mocked my uniform and my salary, but what they conveniently left out of their cruel speeches was the secret reality of my life for the past 6 years. When I was 22, my father called me sobbing uncontrollably. He said his heart was failing. He told me the experimental treatments were not covered by our insurance, and they were drowning in massive medical debt. He begged me not to tell Jessica because she needed to focus entirely on her undergraduate studies and getting into Harvard Law. He said I was the only one who could step up and save the family. So I did. I stepped up without a moment's hesitation. Every single month for 6 long years, the exact moment my paycheck cleared from the logistics firm, I immediately transferred 60% of it directly into my parents' joint bank account. I kept exactly enough to survive and absolutely nothing more. My studio apartment was practically a closet. The heater barely worked during the brutal Chicago winters. I slept under 3 layers of cheap blankets, wearing my heavy winter coat just to keep from freezing in my own bed. I bought my clothes from clearance bins at local thrift stores. I lived on rice beans and whatever discounted bread the corner bakery was throwing out at closing time. I worked 50 and sometimes 60 hours a week at the payroll desk, picking up every single holiday shift and weekend overtime, just to ensure I could make my father's supposed medical payments. I never went on vacations. I never bought myself a new pair of shoes. I did not go out with friends or have any kind of social life. I sacrificed the absolute best years of my 20s because I genuinely loved my family. I believed with my whole entire heart that my grueling labor was keeping my father alive. Every time I transferred that money, Catherine would send a quick text saying thank you for doing your duty. That was it. No warmth, no gratitude, no acknowledgement of the fact that I was starving myself to keep them afloat. Just a cold reminder that I had paid my monthly tax for being the dumb one. The ultimate breaking point, the exact moment the blindfold was finally violently ripped from my eyes, happened just 3 days after that humiliating family dinner. It was a Friday night. I was driving home from a completely exhausting 12-hour overtime shift. The sky had broken open, unleashing a massive freezing rainstorm that flooded the suburban streets. My car was a beat-up old sedan with over 200,000 miles on it. I had been ignoring a terrible rattling sound in the engine for weeks because I simply could not afford to take it to a mechanic. I had just transferred my entire 2-week paycheck to my parents that very morning, leaving myself almost completely broke. I was miles away from my apartment, driving down a dark, unlit stretch of road, when the engine suddenly gave out with a sickening metallic crunch. The steering wheel locked instantly. The headlights flickered and completely died. I barely managed to wrestle the heavy car over to the muddy shoulder before everything went completely dark. I sat there, shivering violently in the freezing cabin as the rain pounded aggressively against the windshield. I tried to restart the engine over and over again, but it was completely dead. I checked my bank account on my phone. I had exactly $14.32 left to my name. A tow truck and a basic diagnostic fee would cost at least $200. I had absolutely no one else to call. So swallowing my pride and my fear, I dialed my mother. She answered on the 4th ring. I could clearly hear smooth jazz music and the clinking of crystal wine glasses in the background. I told her I was stranded on the side of a dangerous road in the pouring rain. I told her my car was completely dead and I was terrified someone might hit me in the dark. I asked if she could please just loan me $200 so I could get a tow truck home. Just $200 out of the hundreds of thousands I had quietly sent them over the last 6 years. My mother sighed loudly, a sound of profound extreme annoyance. "Harper," she said, her voice completely devoid of any maternal concern or warmth, "we simply do not have the liquid cash for your car troubles right now." I stared at my phone in absolute shock. I reminded her that I had just transferred $2,000 to their account barely 12 hours ago. Catherine scoffed. "Yes, and that money is already fully allocated. Jessica needs a bespoke graduation dress for the Plaza Hotel party. Terrence is flying in a high-end designer from New York for a fitting tomorrow morning. She cannot show up to her own coronation looking like a peasant. We need every single penny we have. You will just have to figure it out yourself. Walk to a gas station or call a coworker. Stop being so dramatic and ruining our evening." Before I could even form the words to respond, she hung up. The line went completely dead. The sudden silence of the disconnected call echoed loudly in the small freezing cabin of my dead car. I sat there in the pitch black listening to the relentless rain, and for a long time, I could not even draw a breath. I was completely alone, shivering, stranded, and absolutely terrified. And my mother had just abandoned me on a dangerous highway to fund a designer dress for my sister. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal washed over me in crushing waves of physical nausea. I thought about the luxurious mahogany dining table. I thought about Terrence and his custom Italian suits. I thought about the $13 million mansion they lived in while I froze in a broken car. And then my mind shifted to the brutal, uncompromising math. I was a payroll clerk. My entire professional life revolved around tracking money, auditing numbers, and finding deep financial discrepancies. Sitting in the cold dark, my analytical brain finally kicked into high gear, slicing through years of emotional manipulation. If my father had been dealing with a catastrophic heart condition for 6 years, he would have shown some physical signs of illness. He would have had extended hospital stays, visible weakness, or expensive medical equipment in the house. But William played 18 holes of golf every single weekend. He drank expensive bourbon and ate rich, heavy steaks. He was the absolute picture of perfect, robust health. Where was my money actually going? The narrative they had fed me my entire adult life began to unravel at lightning speed. I had been transferring thousands of dollars every single month into a massive black hole, blindly trusting the very same people who called me a worthless disappointment to my face. The cold realization hardened into something far more powerful than sadness or grief. It transformed instantly into a burning white-hot fury. I spent that entire night sleeping in the freezing backseat of my dead car because I could not afford the tow. But I did not cry. Not a single tear fell from my eyes. Instead, I spent those agonizing dark hours making a silent, unbreakable promise to myself. I was going to find out exactly what they were doing with my money. I realized I had unfettered access to public property tax records, shell company registries, and sophisticated financial tracking software through my job. I had the exact tools needed to dismantle their entire facade piece by piece. I had just never used them against my own family before because I genuinely thought we were a team. I thought my intense sacrifices were keeping my father alive. As the sun finally began to rise over the rain-soaked streets, bringing a harsh gray morning light into my freezing car, my resolve was permanently set. They thought I was just the dumb one, a convenient ATM they could abuse, mock and discard whenever they pleased. But they forgot that the dumb one spent 60 hours a week tracking highly complex financial data. I was going to follow the money, every single solitary cent of it. And I was going to expose whatever rotten, twisted lies they were hiding beneath the polished, pristine floors of that massive mansion. The next morning, I walked into the logistics firm 2 hours before my shift officially started. My body was completely stiff from sleeping in the freezing backseat of my dead car, and my uniform blouse was hopelessly wrinkled. I carried a cheap cup of black coffee from a gas station, holding it tightly just to bring some warmth back into my numb fingers. The office was entirely empty. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights clicking to life overhead. I sat down at my desk and booted up my dual-monitor workstation. For 6 years, I had sat in this exact chair, processing payroll, managing corporate ledgers, and tracking complex financial discrepancies for a massive company. I knew exactly how to follow money. I knew how to unearth hidden assets, find buried accounts, and trace wire transfers across multiple banking institutions. I had simply never aimed those professional skills at my own family because I thought we were bound by love. I thought I was saving my father from a tragic terminal illness. But as I stared at the glowing blue screen, my hands hovering over the keyboard, that naive, dutiful version of Harper officially died. I started with the medical debts. My father, William, had claimed for years that his experimental heart treatments were draining their accounts and destroying their credit. He told me he was drowning in hospital liens and fighting off aggressive medical collection agencies. In the modern American financial system, debt of that magnitude leaves a massive, undeniable paper trail. You cannot hide it. I logged into the public court registries and the comprehensive background check software I used for verifying high-level corporate contractors. I typed in my father's full legal name, his social security number, and his current address. I ran a deep search for civil judgments, medical bankruptcies, county liens, and collection lawsuits. The search bar loaded for a few agonizing seconds. The results came back completely blank. There were 0 medical collections. There were 0 bankruptcies. My father did not have a single civil judgment against him. In fact, his public credit profile was absolutely immaculate. He had a pristine credit score and perfectly managed high-limit accounts. A man drowning in experimental medical treatments would have a fractured financial history visible in a dozen different databases. William Sterling had none. The catastrophic heart condition, the desperate late-night phone calls begging for cash, the tears he cried telling me I was the only one who could save him. It was all a meticulously crafted, completely fabricated lie. I felt a sharp physical wave of nausea roll through my stomach, but I forced myself to swallow it down. The anger was rising fast, replacing the heartbreak with a cold clinical focus. I was not done digging. If there were no medical bills, then where exactly had my money gone? Every single month for 6 years, I had wired 60% of my income to a specific routing and account number my father had provided. I opened a new tab and navigated to the county tax assessor website. Real estate records in the state of Illinois are a matter of public record if you know how to navigate the portal. I typed in the address of my parents' $13 million mansion. The property details loaded instantly, detailing the sprawling square footage, the heated pool, the custom-built guest house, and most importantly, the astronomical annual property taxes. A house of that immense value carried a brutal tax burden that had to be paid in heavy installments to avoid state foreclosure. I clicked on the payment history ledger for the property. A long column of dates and massive payment amounts filled the right side of my screen. Then I pulled out my phone and opened my own mobile banking app, pulling up the historical statements for my personal checking account. I dragged my bank statement right next to the county tax ledger and began matching the rows. The truth hit me so hard, the breath was literally knocked out of my lungs. Every single time I transferred my hard-earned money into my father's account, a matching payment was made to the county tax office exactly 2 days later. The dates aligned with absolute terrifying precision. My father had not been using my money to pay for life-saving medicine. My parents were completely cash poor. They lived in a $13 million mansion they could not actually afford to maintain. They wanted the elite high society lifestyle, the country club memberships, the designer clothes, and the pristine reputation of generational wealth, but they did not have the liquid cash to pay the massive state property taxes required to keep the estate. So they manipulated their vulnerable blue-collar daughter into footing the bill. I was literally working 60 hours a week, eating discounted bread and sleeping in a freezing studio apartment so my parents could pretend to be ultra-wealthy aristocrats in their massive mansion. But the math still did not completely add up. The property taxes were huge, but they only accounted for about 70% of the total funds I had transferred over the last 6 years. There were tens of thousands of dollars completely unaccounted for. I needed to know where every single penny had gone. I grabbed a notepad and wrote down the routing number I had been wiring my money to all these years. I used a banking identification registry to trace the institution. It was a private wealth management branch downtown. I ran the specific account details through a state business registry portal to see if the account was linked to an entity rather than an individual. The search returned a hit immediately. The account I had been draining my life savings into was not a standard personal checking account. It was the primary operating account for a private limited liability company called Sterling Legacy Holdings, LLC. I pulled the public corporate charter for the LLC. The document loaded revealing the registered agents and the designated managing members of the company. My mother, Catherine, was listed as the primary director, but right beneath her name, listed as salaried managing partners, were 2 other people, Jessica and Terence. I stared at their names printed in crisp black ink on the official state document. Terence, the arrogant corporate attorney who had mocked my cheap uniform and bragged about his massive billable hours. Jessica, my golden child sister, who looked down on me for being a basic payroll clerk. They were legally drawing regular consulting fees from an LLC funded almost entirely by my direct deposits. The sheer magnitude of their deception unspooled before my eyes in perfect, horrifying clarity. I traced the expenditure reports linked to the LLC's public filings. My money had been funneled out of that holding account to pay for the down payment on Terence's luxury sports car. My overtime hours had paid the monthly lease on Jessica's upscale downtown styling studio. My skipped meals and my thrift store clothes had directly funded their lavish vacations to Cancun and their expensive reservations at 5-star restaurants. The $25,000 catering bill for the Plaza Hotel that they had demanded I pay just 3 nights ago. They wanted me to deposit the money directly into this exact same LLC account. They were quite literally forcing the family ATM to finance their high society coronation. I sat back in my cheap office chair, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing loudly above my head. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously orchestrated, that it felt like an actual physical weight pressing down on my chest. For my entire life, they had called me the dumb one. They had completely convinced me that I possessed no real intellect, no vision, and absolutely no value outside of what physical labor I could provide. They had broken my spirit when I was just a child, weaponizing my early struggles with reading to convince me I was inherently inferior. And I had believed them. I had swallowed their toxic narrative whole and dedicated my entire existence to proving I was at least useful to the people who despised me. But as I looked at the undeniable financial evidence glowing on my monitors, the tears that had been threatening to fall completely dried up. I was not the dumb one. I was the one keeping their entire fraudulent empire from crashing down into the dirt. Without my relentless blue-collar labor, William and Catherine would have lost that mansion to the county tax assessor years ago. Without my quiet, desperate sacrifices, Terence and Jessica would not be able to maintain their arrogant elite facade. They were nothing but parasites, feeding off the very daughter they endlessly mocked. A terrifying, icy calm washed over me, completely replacing the heartbreak. I slowly closed out the public registry tabs and cleared my search history on the payroll terminal. I leaned back and took a long, deep breath of the stale office air. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I would blindly transfer the $25,000 by Friday because I always folded under their psychological abuse. They were absolutely certain that the dumb one would never look behind the curtain. I picked up my cold cup of gas station coffee and took a slow, deliberate sip. I was not going to cry over them ever again. Instead, I was going to let them plan their grand, luxurious graduation party. I was going to let them invite every single wealthy snob and corporate partner in their entire social circle. And then I was going to use every single piece of information I just uncovered to burn their fraudulent empire straight to the ground. The freezing rain from the night before had finally stopped, leaving behind a bitter and biting chill that seemed to seep directly into my bones. Since my car was completely dead on the side of the highway, I had to take a grueling 2-hour bus ride from the city out to the affluent gated community where my parents lived. I sat near the back of the rattling bus, clutching my cheap canvas tote bag against my chest. Inside that bag were the printed public property tax records and the corporate registry documents for Sterling Legacy Holdings LLC. My hands were practically numb, but my mind was operating with a terrifying clarity. I was no longer the frightened, dutiful daughter who had slept in her freezing back seat. I was an investigator walking into a crime scene. I intended to walk right through their custom mahogany front doors, slam those papers onto their pristine kitchen counter, and force my father to look me directly in the eye and explain why he had faked a terminal heart condition to steal my youth. When the bus finally dropped me off near the entrance of their exclusive neighborhood, I walked the remaining mile on foot. My cheap canvas sneakers soaked through from the lingering puddles on the perfectly manicured sidewalks. The towering wrought iron gates of their subdivision loomed ahead. I knew the pedestrian entry code by heart. I punched it in and slipped inside, walking past sprawling properties with massive circular driveways and luxury vehicles. When I finally reached my parents' $13 million estate, I stopped and just stared at it. The massive stone columns, the perfectly trimmed hedges, the expensive imported cars parked in the driveway, including Terence's sleek new luxury sports car. Everything in my line of sight had been subsidized by my starvation. Every single brick and blade of grass was paid for with the hours of my life I would never get back. Instead of marching up to the grand front doors and ringing the bell like an aggressive intruder, I instinctively defaulted to my usual pattern of behavior. I walked around to the discreet side entrance near the kitchen. I still had the old spare key they had given me years ago for when they needed me to come over and do their heavy holiday cleaning. I slipped the key into the lock and turned it quietly. The heavy door clicked open without a sound. I stepped into the massive gourmet kitchen. The air inside the house was instantly warm and heavily scented with expensive espresso and my mother's signature floral perfume. The house felt deceptively calm. I took off my soaked sneakers, leaving them carefully on the utility mat so I would not track dirty water onto Catherine's imported Italian marble floors. I clutched my canvas tote bag tightly and began walking down the wide, long hallway toward the main living areas of the house. The thick, expensive Persian runner rugs completely muffled my footsteps. I was a ghost in my own family home. As I approached the grand formal study located just off the main living room, I heard the faint sound of ice clinking against heavy crystal glasses. I stopped dead in my tracks. The thick mahogany double doors of the study were left cracked open just an inch or two. A warm golden light spilled out from the crack cutting across the dark hallway floor. I could hear voices drifting out from the comfortable warmth of the room. It was my father William, my mother Catherine, and my brother-in-law Terence. They were laughing. It was a rich, relaxed, arrogant sound. I was about to push the doors open and confront them when I heard my own name drop from my mother's lips. Her tone was dripping with absolute disgust. I cannot believe the sheer audacity of Harper calling me last night. Catherine scoffed, her voice sharp and unyielding, crying about a broken-down car in the rain. She completely ruined the mood of our evening. She has absolutely no concept of real sacrifice. My breath caught sharply in my throat. My heart began to hammer a violent, frantic rhythm against my ribs. I pressed my back tightly against the cold hallway wall, completely out of sight. My hands were trembling, but my mind flashed back to the evidence I had gathered. I reached into my canvas tote bag, pulled out my phone, and quickly opened the voice memo application. I hit the red record button and silently slipped the phone back into the open top of my bag to capture every single word they were saying. William let out a deep, booming chuckle. The sound made my stomach physically churn. "Let it go, Catherine," my father said smoothly. "You handled it perfectly. We just need to keep the dumb payroll clerk on the hook for exactly 3 more weeks. Once the graduation party is paid for, we will not have to deal with her dramatic little phone calls ever again." I stood frozen in the dim hallway. The dumb payroll clerk. Hearing my father say those words when he thought I was nowhere around confirmed every single horrific suspicion I had harbored since the previous night. Terence spoke up next. His voice was smooth-polished and incredibly arrogant. I could vividly picture him sitting in one of the leather wingback chairs, swirling a glass of $1,000 scotch. "You have to admit," William Terence drawled lazily, "the girl is remarkably easy to manipulate. I have negotiated corporate mergers that took months of aggressive legal maneuvering. But Harper, you just feed her a tiny crumb of familial duty, and she hands over her entire miserable paycheck. She really is the family's free ATM." Terence laughed loudly at his own cruel joke, and my parents immediately joined in. Their collective laughter echoed off the high ceilings of the study. It was a monstrous, suffocating sound. They were actively celebrating my financial and emotional ruin. I honestly do not know how she survives in that depressing little closet she calls an apartment. Catherine added, her tone shifting into a mockingly pitying register. "And the clothes she wears. It is genuinely embarrassing. I pray none of my friends ever run into her at the grocery store. It is a miracle she can even navigate a basic spreadsheet given her childhood learning delays. We always knew she was a permanently flawed investment." "Yes, well, the investment has finally run its course," William stated, his voice taking on a cold, hard business-like edge. "The massive catering invoice for the Plaza Hotel is the final major expense we needed her to cover. Jessica graduating from Harvard Law is the absolute peak of our family legacy. This party is the coronation. It will officially secure Terence and Jessica's position in the elite social sphere. They will take over the primary management of the estate, and our brand will be completely untouchable." "And what exactly is the exit strategy for our favorite little ATM?" Terence asked, his tone casually curious. "We cut the dead weight," William replied, without a single ounce of hesitation. "The moment the Plaza Hotel invoice clears and Jessica has her networking event, we are going to formally evict Harper from our lives entirely. I am changing the security codes to the gates. We are blocking her phone number on all our devices. If she tries to show up here begging for an explanation, we will simply have the neighborhood security escort her off the premises for trespassing. She is an embarrassment to our brand, and she has completely outlived her menial usefulness. We are cutting her off forever." "I promise you," William Terence said smoothly, "my legal team can draft a preemptive cease and desist letter just in case she tries to cause any sort of scene. But honestly, she is far too weak and stupid to put up a real fight. She will just crawl back to her little desk and quietly disappear." "Exactly," my mother agreed, sounding profoundly relieved. "It will be like she never even existed." I stood perfectly still in the shadowed hallway, staring at the thin sliver of golden light spilling from the study doors. My phone rested silently in my tote bag, recording every single vile, unforgivable word. The people inside that room were not my family. They were ruthless, calculating predators who had spotted a vulnerable target and systematically drained her dry for 6 long years. The crushing, agonizing pain that had been living in my chest for my entire life suddenly vanished completely. The desperate longing for my parents' approval, the deep-seated fear that I was not smart enough, the guilt over never doing quite enough for them. All of it completely evaporated. In its place, a massive, terrifying glacier of pure ice formed in my veins. I reached into my bag, stopped the audio recording, and carefully saved the file to multiple secure cloud drives. I had the absolute undeniable proof I needed. They had literally confessed to treating me like a disposable financial asset. They had proudly outlined their exact malicious timeline to discard me the moment they extracted my final penny. I did not push the doors open. I did not storm into the study, demanding a tearful, dramatic confrontation. Confrontation implies a desire for resolution or an apology. I no longer wanted an apology from William, Catherine, or Terence. I did not want them to feel guilty. I wanted to completely and utterly dismantle the fake, luxurious reality they were currently sitting in. I wanted to burn their fraudulent aristocratic empire to the very ground. I slowly and silently backed away from the study doors. I walked down the thick Persian rug, retracing my steps back to the kitchen. I slipped my wet canvas sneakers back onto my feet, grabbed my cheap tote bag, and exited quietly through the side door, locking it securely behind me. As I walked down the long, perfectly manicured driveway, my head held extremely high, I pulled my phone out of my bag and played the recording back just to hear the undeniable reality of their voices one more time. The crisp, high-quality audio captured the clinking of their crystal glasses and the rich, arrogant timbre of Terence's voice calling me a free ATM. It captured the absolute lack of hesitation in my father's voice when he outlined how they would throw me away like common household trash. Every single syllable was a vital piece of ammunition that I would carefully hoard for the upcoming slaughter. The sheer level of their entitlement was truly breathtaking. They were sitting inside a home funded entirely by my starvation, plotting my ultimate emotional execution while sipping incredibly expensive scotch. The psychological abuse they had inflicted on me since I was a child was not a tragic accident of poor parenting. It was a highly deliberate, highly calculated tool of subjugation. By making me believe I was the dumb one who constantly owed them a massive unpayable debt, they ensured my complete and absolute compliance. I reached the heavy wrought iron security gates of the neighborhood and punched in the exit code. The heavy metal door swung open slowly, groaning in the damp, chilly air. I stepped out onto the main public road, waiting for the municipal bus that would take me back to my freezing, leaky studio apartment in the city. But the physical discomfort of my wet shoes and my exhausted body no longer mattered to me. My physical reality was merely temporary now. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed to seek highly specialized legal counsel. I needed to completely bypass the standard family dynamics and attack their vulnerable corporate structure. William and Catherine thought they were untouchable behind the shield of Sterling Legacy Holdings, LLC, but I knew that holding companies required massive amounts of genuine capital to survive state audits. I knew their entire lifestyle was built on a fragile house of cards ready to collapse under the slightest gust of real legal scrutiny. The bus finally arrived, its massive doors opening with a loud hiss of air. I climbed aboard, paid my fare with the last few coins in my pocket, and sat near the foggy window, watching the wealthy suburban estates blur past me. I was no longer Harper, the naive payroll clerk who desperately sought her parents' love. I was a completely, fully weaponized version of myself, armed with public tax records, corporate filings, and a devastating audio confession. They had specifically designed the timeline for their own ultimate destruction. They wanted to wait 3 more weeks until Jessica's lavish graduation party at the Plaza Hotel. They wanted the grand stage. They wanted the high society coronation. I smiled, staring out at the grey sky. I decided right then and there that I would happily give them their grand stage. I would let them invite every single important corporate contact and wealthy socialite they knew. I would let them stand under the glittering chandeliers and bask in their fraudulent glory. Because when the time finally came, I would not just cut them off. I would ensure they lost absolutely everything in front of the very audience they had sacrificed my entire life to impress. I was just about to turn away from the heavy mahogany doors and make my silent escape down the hallway when I heard the sharp sound of a chair scraping aggressively against the hardwood floor. Footsteps were moving directly toward the doorway. Panic seized my entire body. I could not be caught eavesdropping. If my father found me lurking in the shadows outside his study, the psychological abuse would instantly escalate into something much worse. I frantically looked around the dimly lit corridor. Just a few feet to my left was the entrance to my father's private inner office, a small windowless room attached to the main study where he kept his most confidential files. I lunged toward the heavy oak door, grabbed the brass handle, and slipped inside, pulling it shut just a fraction of a second before the main study door swung open. I stood frozen in the pitch-black room, pressing my spine tightly against the cold plaster wall. I held my breath until my lungs burned, listening to the muffled voices of my parents and Terence moving down the hallway toward the grand foyer. They were laughing about their upcoming vacation, leaving the study completely empty. I waited for what felt like an eternity, shivering in my damp uniform blouse. My heart was hammering a violent rhythm against my ribs. When I was absolutely certain they had gone upstairs, I finally exhaled a shaky breath and reached into my cheap canvas tote bag for my phone. I turned on the flashlight application to guide my way back out. The harsh white beam of my phone cut through the darkness, sweeping across the expensive leather furniture and the towering bookshelves. But as the light washed over my father's massive antique desk, something metallic caught the sudden glare. I moved the light closer. The bottom drawer of his desk was left pulled open just an inch or two. A small silver key was still dangling carelessly from the lock. My father was a man obsessed with absolute control and total secrecy. He never left his private files unsecured. He must have been rushed or distracted by the bourbon and the arrogant plotting with Terence. My analytical mind, the very same mind they had just mocked as dull and pathetic, screamed at me to look inside. I had already uncovered their holding company and the property tax fraud, but a locked drawer in a hidden office meant something far more valuable was buried here. I crept quietly around the desk, my wet sneakers making no sound on the thick rug. I knelt on the floor and slowly pulled the heavy wooden drawer open. It glided silently on its metal tracks. Inside the drawer, there was no cash or standard financial ledgers. There was only a single thick manila envelope, sealed with a thick layer of red wax that had been broken open. My breath hitched in my throat when I saw the name written across the front in an elegant, familiar cursive script. It read simply, "For Harper when the time is right." The handwriting belonged to my late grandmother, Evelyn. She had passed away 3 years ago after a sudden illness. Grandma Evelyn was the only person in the Sterling family who had ever shown me genuine warmth. While my parents poured all their affection and resources into Jessica, my grandmother used to sit with me for hours, patiently helping me read and telling me that my quiet intelligence was a rare gift. She had always seen right through my father's arrogant facade and my mother's shallow materialism. But when she died, my parents told me she had left her entire estate to charitable foundations and had left us nothing but sentimental junk. They told me she had passed away penniless. My hands shook violently as I pulled the thick stack of legal documents out of the envelope. I sat cross-legged on the floor of the dark office, aiming my phone flashlight at the crisp white pages. The header of the very first page was emblazoned with the logo of a prestigious wealth management firm. It was a formal declaration of a massive blind trust and a last will and testament. I began to read the dense legal text, my eyes scanning the paragraphs with the trained speed of a seasoned payroll clerk. The opening clauses explicitly detailed Grandma Evelyn's deep disappointment in her son William. She wrote that she had watched him become consumed by pure greed and shallow status. She stated clearly that she knew he favored Jessica and systematically neglected me. And then I read the specific terms of her actual inheritance. My heart practically stopped beating. According to the legally binding document in my trembling hands, the $13 million mansion my parents were currently living in did not belong to them. It never had. Grandma Evelyn had never legally transferred the deed to my father. Instead, she had placed the property deed directly into a secure trust, naming me as the sole irrevocable beneficiary. The house I was currently sitting in, the massive estate my parents used to project their high society wealth, legally belonged entirely to me. But the revelations did not stop there. I turned to the second page, my mind struggling to process the astronomical numbers printed in bold black ink. Grandma Evelyn had not died penniless. She had quietly liquidated her massive stock portfolios and established an ironclad blind trust valued at exactly $50 million. And right there under the beneficiary designation was my full legal name. The trust was entirely mine. She had left me a $50 million fortune specifically to protect me from the financial abuse she knew my parents would inflict. A small handwritten letter on her personal stationery was clipped to the back of the final page. I unclipped it and read her familiar, elegant writing. "My dearest Harper," she wrote, "if you are reading this, then my lawyers have finally found you, or you have discovered the truth yourself. I am so deeply sorry I could not protect you while I was alive. Your father cares only for appearances, and I knew he would try to drain you of your generous spirit. I have left you the estate and the trust, so you will never have to depend on their conditional love ever again. Do not let them make you feel small. You are brilliant, and you are so incredibly worthy. Use this wealth to build a beautiful life. All my love, Grandma Evelyn. I sat alone in the dark, clutching my grandmother's letter to my chest. Hot, angry tears finally spill over my eyelashes, sliding down my cold cheeks. The profound magnitude of my parents' deception hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. They had known about this will. They had deliberately suppressed these legal documents for 3 entire years. They hid my $50 million inheritance in a locked desk drawer so they could continue to control the narrative. But then the final horrific piece of the puzzle clicked into place in my analytical mind. The property taxes. My parents did not just hide my wealth so they could maintain their elite social status. They hid my wealth because they needed me to remain entirely impoverished. They knew that if I discovered I owned the $13 million mansion, I would kick them out immediately. But because they were completely cash poor, they could not afford the massive state property taxes required to keep the house from being seized by the county. So they devised the most evil, twisted scheme imaginable. They manipulated my deep love and loyalty. They faked my father's terminal heart condition. They emotionally blackmailed me into transferring 60% of my miserable payroll salary to their holding company. And then they took my hard-earned money and used it to quietly pay the property taxes on the mansion that I actually legally owned. They were literally making me pay the taxes on my own stolen inheritance while I starved in a freezing studio apartment. The sheer psychological cruelty of their plan was absolutely staggering. They called me the dumb one. They mocked my thrift store clothes and my cheap canvas sneakers. They let Terrence humiliate me over a catering bill, all while they were secretly living as highly illegal squatters inside my house, relying entirely on my stolen wages to keep a roof over their heads. They had turned me into an indentured servant funding my own stolen property. I wiped the tears from my face with the back of my raw, calloused hand. The profound sorrow I felt for my grandmother's passing was entirely eclipsed by a rage so bright and hot, it felt like staring directly into the sun. I was completely done crying over these people. I was done begging for a seat at their mahogany table. I was the actual owner of the table. I was the owner of the house. I was a multimillionaire disguised in a faded payroll uniform, and they had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet was about to collapse. I picked up my phone and opened the camera application. I meticulously photographed every single page of the will, the trust documents, the property deed, and my grandmother's handwritten letter. I captured the notary stamps and the specific legal seals, ensuring the images were perfectly crisp and legible. I emailed the entire batch of photographs to 3 separate secure addresses. I was gathering the ultimate ammunition to completely destroy their lives. When I was finished, I carefully placed the documents back inside the manila envelope. I slid the envelope back into the bottom drawer exactly where I had found it and gently pushed the drawer shut. I left the small silver key dangling carelessly from the lock, just as my father had left it. I wanted them to remain completely blind and arrogant. I wanted them to walk into the Plaza Hotel in 3 weeks believing they had won. I stood up in the dark office, my spine perfectly straight. The terrified, financially abused girl who had entered this house an hour ago was completely dead and gone. I slipped out of the private office, walking down the silent hallway with a new, undeniable sense of power. They had planned to formally evict me from their lives after extracting my final penny. Now I was going to use my $50 million reality to evict them from high society forever. I rode the municipal bus back to my drafty studio apartment as the sun finally crested over the Chicago skyline. My clothes were still damp from the rain, and I was functioning on absolutely zero sleep, but my mind had never been sharper. I sat at my small, wobbly kitchen table and pulled up the photographs I had taken of my late grandmother's documents. The legal jargon was dense, but one name stood out clearly at the bottom of the trust declaration. Harrison. He was the managing attorney for a prestigious wealth management firm located right in the heart of the downtown financial district. I stared at his name glowing on my cracked phone screen. I had the absolute undeniable proof of my parents' massive fraud, but proof meant absolutely nothing without a high-powered legal team to enforce it. And therein lay my biggest problem. I had exactly $14.32 left in my bank account. I could not even afford a standard consultation fee, let alone retain a corporate attorney to take down my family. But I also knew I could not stop now. The blazing fury in my chest pushed me forward. I changed out of my damp uniform, put on my only clean professional outfit, a faded navy blazer I had bought from a clearance rack 3 years ago, and walked right back out the door. I found the address listed on the trust document and walked through the heavy revolving doors of a massive corporate high-rise. I rode the elevator up to the 40th floor, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The double glass doors of the law firm opened into a breathtaking reception area lined with imported marble and expensive modern art. A polished receptionist in a designer suit looked up from her mahogany desk as I approached. Her eyes instantly darted to my scuffed shoes and my cheap faded blazer. I could see the immediate calculation in her gaze, the same dismissive look my mother always gave me. I cleared my throat, trying to project a confidence I absolutely did not feel. I asked to speak with Mr. Harrison regarding a private estate matter. The receptionist offered a thin, extremely tight smile and asked if I had an appointment. When I admitted I did not, she patronizingly informed me that Mr. Harrison was a senior managing partner and did not take walk-in consultations. She slid a glossy business card across the desk and suggested I call back to schedule a preliminary screening with a junior associate next month. The sheer panic threatened to choke me. 3 weeks. I only had 3 weeks until Jessica's lavish graduation party at the Plaza Hotel, where my parents planned to formally evict me from their lives. I could not wait a month. I told her I was there regarding the Evelyn Sterling Trust and that it was an absolute emergency. The receptionist sighed loudly, her patience clearly running thin. She reached for her phone, presumably to call security, and have the dumb blue-collar girl escorted out of the lobby. Just as she lifted the receiver, a deep, calm voice echoed from the heavy oak doors leading to the inner offices. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. I turned around and saw a tall, distinguished man in a custom-tailored charcoal suit standing in the doorway. He had silver hair, sharp, observant eyes, and the careful, measured posture of someone who spent his entire life dominating courtrooms. He looked directly at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of intense recognition cross his face. The receptionist immediately stood up, stammering slightly, as she explained that a walk-in was demanding an unscheduled meeting. The man ignored her entirely. He walked slowly across the marble floor, his gaze locked firmly on my face. "You look exactly like her," he said, his voice softening into something incredibly warm and unexpectedly kind. "You have Evelyn's eyes?" My breath caught in my throat. I stood perfectly still, clutching my tote bag as the man extended his hand. "I am Marcus Harrison," he said formally. "I was your grandmother's personal attorney and the executor of her estate. I have been waiting for you to walk through those doors for 3 very long years, Harper." I stared at him in absolute shock. "You know who I am?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He offered a small, knowing smile and gestured toward his private office. "I know exactly who you are, Harper," he said. "Please come in. We have a massive amount of work to do today." I followed him into a sprawling corner office that overlooked the entire city. He closed the heavy doors behind us, instantly muting the noise of the reception area. Harrison directed me to a plush leather chair across from his massive desk. Before I could even pull my phone out to show him the photographs I had taken, he walked over to a secure wall safe typed in a complex code and pulled out a thick, heavy file. "Your grandmother was a brilliant woman, Harper." He began, his tone shifting into a sharp professional register. "She saw exactly what your father was becoming. She knew William was entirely consumed by toxic greed, and she knew he was funneling all his resources into Jessica while treating you like a disposable asset. She established this blind trust specifically to protect you from his financial abuse. I told him everything. I told him about the massive catering bill, the fake medical debts, and the horrifying audio recording I had captured the night before. I explained how they had been illegally using my meager payroll salary to pay the property taxes on the mansion. In fact, his jaw tightened with a cold, righteous anger. William committed deliberate, egregious property fraud, Harrison stated firmly. "When your grandmother passed away, I contacted your father to formally initiate the transfer of the estate to you. William claimed you were medically unfit to manage your own finances due to your childhood learning delays. He presented forged medical evaluations and petitioned the court to suppress the will while he, acting as your guardian, maintained physical control of the property. Because you were completely isolated and unaware of your rights, he was able to stall the probate process. But his control over that $13 million mansion is entirely fraudulent. He is legally a squatter in your home. I sat there, absorbing his words. My parents had orchestrated a massive psychological operation against me. They had purposefully weaponized my childhood struggles to legally rob me of my future. They had effectively stolen my voice and my wealth in one brutal, completely coordinated strike. My heart hammered against my ribs as the sheer scale of my father's illegal manipulation laid itself bare. Harrison opened the heavy file and pulled out a stack of crisp official documents. He slid them across the desk toward me. "This is the finalized, verified deed to the estate," he said, tapping the heavy parchment. "It is registered exclusively in your name." "And this," he added as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek rectangular piece of paper, "is what your grandmother wanted you to have the exact moment you realized your own worth." He handed me a certified bank check. I looked down at the numbers printed across the center, and the room completely spun. It was a check for $50 million drawn directly from the liquidated assets of the Evelyn Sterling Trust. It was made out entirely to me. "You are not a broke payroll clerk," Harper Harrison said, his voice ringing with absolute undeniable authority. "You are the sole heir to a $50 million empire, and your parents have been illegally squatting in your house while bleeding you dry." I sat there, holding the $50 million check, my calloused hands shaking violently. It represented absolute total freedom from the generational abuse I had quietly endured. My father had stood in that dining room and called me a dumb, pathetic failure who would never amount to anything. He had demanded my entire life savings to fund my arrogant sister's graduation party. Now I had the actual legal power to completely obliterate their entire existence. I looked up at Harrison, my tears drying instantly. The terrified, dutiful daughter was gone forever. "They want to throw a massive high society graduation party at the Plaza Hotel in 3 weeks," I said, my voice dropping to an icy, calm whisper. "They want to invite every single elite connection they have to celebrate their legacy." Harrison leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He understood exactly what I was planning. "Then we will let them have their grand party," he replied smoothly. "And when the entire room is watching, I will walk in and hand you the envelope. We are going to let them build their fraudulent pedestal as high as possible, so the fall completely destroys them." Walking back into that sprawling $13 million mansion 2 days later was the most surreal experience of my entire life. I was no longer the frightened, exploited daughter who had cowered in the dark hallway just 48 hours prior. My cheap canvas tote bag now held certified legal copies of my $50 million trust and the ironclad property deed to the very house I was standing in. But as I crossed the threshold into the grand foyer, I deliberately hunched my shoulders. I lowered my gaze to the marble floor and let my posture physically broadcast the exhausted, defeated payroll clerk they entirely expected to see. Harrison had explicitly warned me that the key to our legal strategy was absolute total surprise. I had to let them continue their fraudulent behavior uninterrupted while we completely dismantled their financial infrastructure from the shadows. I took a deep, steadying breath, inhaling my mother's heavy floral perfume that lingered in the air, and prepared to give the absolute greatest performance of my life. The occasion was yet another mandatory family dinner. This time it was supposedly to finalize the catering menu for Jessica's massive graduation gala at the Plaza Hotel. But in reality, it was simply another opportunity for them to assert their absolute dominance over me. I walked into the formal dining room and quietly took my designated seat at the far end of the long mahogany table. The room was practically vibrating with their arrogant energy. My father, William, was pouring a $300 bottle of Cabernet into expensive crystal glasses, while my mother, Catherine, adjusted the fresh floral centerpieces. Jessica was sitting next to her husband, Terence, completely absorbed in scrolling through digital fabric swatches on her phone for her bespoke graduation dress. Not a single one of them looked up to greet me when I pulled out my chair. I was just the background noise in their wealthy, aristocratic lives. Terence was the first to acknowledge my presence, and he did so with the exact brand of casual cruelty I had come to expect. He leaned back in his plush velvet chair, adjusting his custom-tailored silk tie, and offered me a deeply condescending smirk. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence. Terence drawled, his voice smooth and dripping with pure malice. I am honestly surprised your ancient little car managed to make it all the way up the driveway, Harper. Did you have to push it the last few miles? Jessica let out a sharp, mean-spirited laugh without even looking up from her phone screen. She probably took the municipal bus, Terence. You know how she insists on living like an absolute peasant. It is honestly humiliating to have a sister who smells like discount laundry detergent when I'm trying to build a high society brand. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, forcing my facial expression to remain completely blank and submissive. I am sorry I am late, I said, my voice soft and deliberately meek. I had to pick up an extra overtime shift at the payroll desk just to make ends meet. My father slammed his wine glass down on the table with a harsh, terrifying crack that would have normally sent me into a full-blown panic attack. Let us bypass the pathetic sob stories, Harper, my father demanded, his eyes narrowing with cold, calculated fury. You caused a completely unacceptable scene earlier this week with your selfish little outburst about the catering bill. We do not want to hear another single word about your miserable blue-collar job or your supposed financial struggles. The only thing I care to hear from you tonight is whether or not you have scheduled the $25,000 wire transfer to our holding company account. The Plaza Hotel requires the final deposit by Friday, and I absolutely refuse to let your stunning incompetence ruin your sister's coronation. My mother leaned across the table, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming aggressively against the polished wood. You need to understand your place in this family, Harper. Catherine added, her tone icy and completely unforgiving. We have tolerated your mediocre existence for 28 years. We poured thousands of dollars into fixing your childhood learning delays. The absolute bare minimum you can do is fund the child who actually possesses the intellect to carry on our legacy. You owe us that money. Do not make me remind you again. The psychological abuse rained down on me in heavy, relentless waves. Just a few days ago, their harsh, biting words would have absolutely crushed my spirit. I would have internalized every single insult, completely believing I was the dumb, worthless failure they relentlessly claimed I was. I would have apologized profusely and drained my entire life savings just to earn a tiny, fleeting fraction of their conditional love. But sitting there that night with the absolute, undeniable truth locked securely in my tote bag, their vicious insults completely lost their power. It was like watching a bizarre, pathetic play where the actors had absolutely no idea the theater was currently burning down around them. I looked at Terence, who was currently bragging about his massive six-figure bonuses and his elite country club memberships. I looked at Jessica, who was whining about how exhausting it was to be brilliant and beautiful. I looked at my parents, who sat at the head of the table, radiating the arrogant confidence of billionaires. They were all completely and utterly broke. They did not own the chairs they were sitting on. They did not own the crystal glasses they were drinking from. The massive $13 million estate they used to intimidate everyone around them was legally registered under my name. I was their landlord. I was the secret silent billionaire quietly funding their entire fraudulent reality. And right at that very moment, while I sat there silently absorbing their vile insults, I knew that Harrison was sitting in his downtown office executing the first phase of our massive financial counterattack. I forced my eyes to well up with fake tears, perfectly playing the role of the broken, compliant victim they desperately needed me to be. I am so sorry, Dad, I whispered, allowing my voice to crack with entirely manufactured guilt. You are completely right. I was being entirely selfish and dramatic. I know how important Jessica's Harvard graduation is to our family legacy. I have already contacted my bank to authorize the $25,000 wire transfer. It will clear into the Sterling Legacy Holdings account by tomorrow morning. The immediate, visible relief that washed over my father's face was truly a spectacle to witness. His tense, angry posture instantly melted into a smug, victorious relaxation. He picked his wineglass back up and took a deep, satisfied sip. I knew you would finally see reason, Harper, he said, his voice returning to that warm, patronizing tone he only used when he was getting exactly what he wanted. You might not be the brightest girl, but at least you understand basic loyalty. Terence chuckled darkly, shaking his head as he cut into his roasted lamb. Good girl, Harper. Just keep quietly writing the checks and let the real adults handle the complicated business of running an empire. I offered Terence a small, tight smile and nodded submissively, picking up my fork to eat the meager portion of dinner my mother had allowed me. They went right back to discussing the lavish details of the Plaza Hotel party, completely ignoring me for the rest of the evening. They discussed the imported caviar they planned to serve, the expensive champagne towers, and the elite guest list of corporate partners and socialites they intended to dazzle. They were absolutely convinced they had successfully beaten me back into total submission. But behind my quiet, compliant smile, my mind was racing with terrifying, calculating precision. What they did not know was that the $25,000 wire transfer I had just promised them was never actually going to clear. Earlier that afternoon, I had sat in Harrison's high-rise office and officially signed the final documents transferring the deed of the mansion entirely into a private LLC that I completely controlled. I was no longer a hidden beneficiary. I was the absolute legal owner of the estate. Furthermore, because I had been the one silently funding the Sterling Legacy Holdings account with my payroll direct deposits for 6 consecutive years. Harrison was able to legally demonstrate that the LLC was operating entirely on my misappropriated funds. We had spent the entire morning filing aggressive emergency injunctions with the State Financial Regulatory Board. While my parents sat at the dining room table, drinking their expensive wine and mocking my cheap clothes, Harrison was systematically freezing every single credit line tied to their names. We were locking down the holding company accounts, severing their access to the massive fraudulent loans they had taken out against the estate they did not even own. I sat there, quietly chewing my food, savoring the intense, agonizing irony of the moment. My father was loudly bragging to Terence about his brilliant investment strategies, entirely unaware that his debit cards were currently being declined across the city. My mother was lecturing Jessica on the importance of generational wealth, completely ignorant of the fact that she was effectively a squatter who was about to face massive civil litigation for staggering property fraud. They had spent my entire life calling me the dumb one, making me feel completely worthless because I struggled to read when I was 7 years old. They had manipulated my deep love and loyalty, using my intense desperation for their approval to turn me into their personal indentured servant. I looked around the sparkling, opulent dining room, my gaze tracing the expensive artwork on the walls and the massive crystal chandelier above our heads. This was my house. This was my wealth. And in exactly 3 weeks, they were going to walk into the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, expecting a massive royal coronation. They were going to stand before hundreds of their elite peers and publicly attempt to throw me away like common household trash. I took a slow, quiet sip of my water, ensuring my hand did not tremble even slightly. I was going to let them have their beautiful, glittering party. I was going to let them put on their expensive designer suits and their custom-tailored gowns. I was going to let them climb all the way to the very top of their fraudulent pedestal, because I wanted the entire high society world to watch when I completely shattered it to dust. The dumb one was finally taking over, and karma was going to be absolutely merciless. The countdown to the graduation gala at the Plaza Hotel had dwindled down to a mere 4 days. The entire mansion was practically buzzing with a frantic, chaotic energy. Caterers were dropping off sample menus, florists were measuring the grand foyer for practice arrangements, and my mother was absolutely frantic about the seating chart. I continued to play my role with absolute sickening perfection. I went to my grueling payroll job, I wore my faded thrift store clothes, and I kept my eyes firmly glued to the floor whenever I walked through their pristine hallways. I was the obedient, invisible ghost they completely expected me to be. But beneath my quiet exterior, my heart was a beating drum of pure, calculated vengeance. Harrison and I had already set the invisible traps. We were quietly suffocating their financial lifelines, cutting off their illegal access to the holding company that my hard-earned money had funded for 6 years. My father had been spending hours locked in his study, screaming at banking executives over the phone, desperately trying to understand why his massive credit accounts were suddenly showing up as frozen. He completely believed it was a temporary corporate glitch. He had absolutely no idea that the noose was already tightening securely around his neck. It was late Thursday evening when my father formally summoned me into his private study. I knocked softly on the heavy mahogany doors and pushed them open. The air inside the room was thick with the smell of stale bourbon and absolute desperation. William was sitting behind his massive antique desk, his tie loosened, his face flushed with stress. My mother, Catherine, was standing by the window clutching a crystal glass of white wine with white-knuckled tension. Jessica and Terence were seated on the plush leather sofa, looking incredibly bored and deeply annoyed by my mere presence. "Sit down, Harper," my father commanded without looking up from the thick stack of legal papers spread out across his desk. I sat on the very edge of the leather guest chair, keeping my posture deliberately small and submissive. He pushed a heavy manila folder across the polished wood toward me. He tapped a solid gold pen against the top page, his eyes finally locking onto mine with a cold, predatory intensity. "As you know, your sister's graduation from Harvard Law is the most significant milestone this family has ever achieved." My father began, his voice taking on that familiar, patronizing tone. "She and Terence are officially stepping into their roles as the primary managers of the Sterling family legacy. They will be taking over the estate, the brand, and all our associated philanthropic endeavors. Because you're simply not equipped to handle the intense pressures of high society wealth, we have decided it is best to formally separate your legal standing from the family trust." He slid the top document out of the folder and pointed the gold pen at the signature line at the very bottom of the page. "This is a standard global waiver and a quitclaim deed," he explained smoothly, waving his hand as if it were nothing more than a basic administrative chore. "It simply states that you voluntarily relinquish any and all future claims to the Sterling estate, including this house and any associated trusts. It is a necessary legal formality to ensure Jessica has a completely clean slate when she takes over. We are calling it your graduation gift to your sister. I need you to sign it right now." I stared down at the crisp white legal document resting on the desk. My analytical mind instantly processed the complex legal jargon printed across the page. This was not a standard family formality. This was a highly aggressive, ironclad legal surrender. My father was terrified. The frozen bank accounts were finally spooking him. He knew my grandmother Evelyn had left everything to me, and he was making one final desperate play to permanently steal my entire $50 million inheritance and the $13 million mansion before I ever discovered the truth. He was banking entirely on my absolute blind loyalty and my supposed lack of intelligence. He thought I was just the dumb payroll clerk who would sign away a massive fortune without asking a single solitary question. Catherine took a slow sip of her wine and sighed loudly. "Do not look so confused, Harper," she snapped, her voice dripping with pure exhaustion. "It is a very simple document. You do not own anything anyway. You have your little payroll job and your small life in the city. This just makes it official, so Terence does not have to worry about you popping out of the woodwork years from now asking for handouts. Just sign the paper and do your duty for this family one last time." Jessica rolled her eyes and leaned her head against Terence's shoulder. "Honestly, Harper, it is the absolute least you can do. You're not exactly contributing to the family brand. Giving me clear legal control is the only valuable thing you have to offer." I kept my eyes glued to the signature line, perfectly hiding the intense white-hot fury burning behind my ribs. The sheer unadulterated audacity of their greed was almost breathtaking. They had drained my bank accounts for 6 years, forcing me to live in freezing poverty while they paid the property taxes on my own stolen house. And now they wanted me to legally hand them the keys to my entire kingdom wrapped up as a graduation present. I slowly reached out and picked up the solid gold pen. My father's shoulders visibly dropped with immense relief. He thought he had completely won. He thought the massive fraudulent empire he had built on my back was finally permanently secure. But as the tip of the pen hovered just an inch above the crisp white paper, I suddenly stopped and slowly placed the pen back down on the mahogany desk. "Dad," I started, my voice trembling with entirely manufactured emotion. "I completely understand. I know that Jessica is the brilliant one. I know that she and Terence represent the absolute best of our family. I know I have always been a disappointment to you and Mom." I paused, forcing a single fake tear to well up in my eye and trace a path down my cheek. But this is a massive moment for our family. This is the official passing of the torch. If I am going to formally step aside and surrender my place in this family, I do not want to do it secretly in a dark study on a random Thursday night. That feels entirely wrong. My father frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together in immediate suspicion. "What exactly are you talking about, Harper?" he demanded sharply. I looked up, meeting his cold gaze with an expression of pure, naive sincerity. "I want to sign this document publicly," I said, my voice soft but incredibly steady. "I want to bring this global waiver to the graduation gala at the Plaza Hotel this Saturday. I want to stand up in front of the entire room and give a toast honoring Jessica. I want to formally and publicly present this signed document to her as my ultimate graduation gift in front of all your wealthy friends and Terrence's high society corporate partners. I want everyone to know that I am officially stepping aside so she can lead the Sterling family into the future. The heavy silence in the study was absolutely palpable. I watched their calculating minds process my incredible offer. I was playing directly into the absolute deepest, darkest core of their intense narcissism. My parents were completely obsessed with public perception. They lived and breathed for the validation of their elite peers. The idea of having their disappointing blue-collar daughter publicly humiliate herself by legally submitting to the golden child in front of hundreds of powerful billionaires was an absolute dream come true for them. It was the ultimate display of dominance and control. Terrence let out a low, appreciative whistle. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, looking at my father with genuine excitement. William, you have to admit, that is actually a brilliant public relations move. Imagine the absolute optics of it. The entire room watching Harper officially bow out and hand the keys to the kingdom directly to my wife. It will show my senior partners that our family is completely unified and completely under our control. It completely solidifies our narrative. Jessica clapped her hands together, a bright, wicked smile spreading across her flawless face. "Oh my God, Dad, that is actually perfect," she squealed. "It will be the absolute highlight of the entire evening. Everyone will see that I am the true heir to the legacy. Please let her do it." My father looked at the unsigned document on his desk and then looked back up at me. His suspicious glare slowly melted into a look of profound, arrogant satisfaction. He completely bought the performance. He truly believed I was so deeply broken, so utterly desperate for their final shred of approval that I was willing to completely destroy myself on a public stage just to please them. He picked up the legal document, carefully sliding it back into the thick manila folder. "Very well, Harper," my father said, his voice vibrating with absolute smug triumph. "You will bring this exact folder to the Plaza Hotel on Saturday night. When it is time for the main toasts, you will take the stage. You will deliver your little speech, honoring your sister, and you will sign this waiver in front of the entire ballroom. If you pull this off without embarrassing us, I might even let you stay for the dessert course before you take the bus back to your miserable apartment." "Thank you, Dad," I whispered, bowing my head submissively. "I promise I will not let you down. I will make sure Saturday night is a moment this family never ever forgets." Catherine let out a harsh, dismissive sigh, turning her attention back to the window. "Just make sure you wear something that does not completely humiliate us," she muttered coldly. "I do not want my friends thinking we employ homeless people." I stood up from the leather chair, keeping my shoulders hunched as I quietly walked out of the study. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me instantly, severing me from their toxic, arrogant presence. As I walked down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the side exit, a slow, dangerous smile finally spread across my face. My entire body hummed with an electric, terrifying adrenaline. The trap was officially set, and the locking mechanism was completely secure. They had absolutely no idea what they had just agreed to. They thought they were setting up my ultimate public humiliation. They thought they were securing their stolen millions in front of their wealthy peers. They thought they were bringing a broken, desperate payroll clerk to the Plaza Hotel to act as their sacrificial lamb. But they were not bringing a payroll clerk to the Plaza Hotel. They were bringing the actual multimillionaire owner of their entire estate. They were bringing the sole beneficiary of the $50 million Evelyn Sterling Trust. And most importantly, they were bringing a woman who possessed the exact legal documents and financial proof necessary to burn their entire fraudulent reality to the ground. They wanted a grand public spectacle. They wanted their elite friends to witness the passing of the torch. And on Saturday night, under the glittering crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom, I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to give them the absolute most devastating, spectacular destruction high society had ever seen. Saturday night arrived with the kind of crisp Manhattan air that always made the city feel electric. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was an absolute masterpiece of Gilded Age opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring painted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over 350 of the wealthiest and most influential people in my parents' social circle. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and glasses of vintage champagne. A classical string quartet played softly from a raised platform in the corner. It was the exact kind of high society spectacle my mother and father lived for. They had spent my entire life chasing this exact level of prestige, and now they were finally putting it all on display. I stood near the heavy brass doors of the ballroom, wearing the very best dress I could afford from a local department store. It was a simple, modest navy blue sheath dress that cost me $45. Surrounded by seas of custom-tailored Italian suits and exclusive runway gowns, I felt entirely invisible. But tonight being invisible was my greatest advantage. My mother, Catherine, spotted me hovering near the entrance. She marched over, her face pinched with extreme disapproval. She looked me up and down, taking in my unbranded dress and my scuffed black heels. She sighed heavily, shaking her head as if my mere presence was a personal insult to her carefully curated aesthetic. "I told you to stay out of the main sightlines, Harper," she hissed under her breath, ensuring none of her wealthy friends could hear her cruelty. "Your table is in the very back corner near the service doors. Go sit down and do not speak to any of the corporate partners unless spoken to. We cannot have you embarrassing Jessica on her special night. Just wait until your father calls you to the stage and do exactly what we practiced." I offered her a meek, obedient nod and quietly made my way through the sea of billionaires and elite socialites toward the back of the massive room. Table 42 was shoved behind a massive marble pillar right next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. My table mates were distant elderly relatives who barely recognized me, and a few junior associates from Terrence's law firm who were clearly annoyed to be seated so far away from the action. I sat down, smoothing my cheap napkin over my lap, and looked out at the glittering crowd. From my dark corner, I had the absolute perfect vantage point to watch the entire fraudulent circus unfold. My sister Jessica was holding court right in the dead center of the ballroom. She was wearing the bespoke designer gown that my mother had rushed to purchase just days ago. The dress was a stunning cascade of emerald silk and hand-sewn crystal beads that sparkled brilliantly under the chandelier light. She looked like an absolute queen receiving her loyal subjects. Guests were lining up just to kiss her cheek and offer their breathless congratulations on her Harvard law degree. She beamed at every single one of them, playing the role of the humble, brilliant heiress with sickening perfection. But I knew the absolute truth. I knew that the emerald silk draped across her shoulders was paid for with the money I had desperately transferred to save my father's supposedly failing heart. She was literally wearing my starvation and my exhaustion. Standing just a few feet away from her was Terrence. He was in his absolute element. He was surrounded by a tight circle of senior managing partners from his prestigious downtown law firm. He was holding a glass of $1,000 scotch, laughing loudly and gesturing expansively as he networked the room. His voice naturally boomed over the classical music, allowing his arrogant boasts to drift all the way back to my hidden table. Terrence was making absolutely sure that every single influential attorney in that circle knew exactly what was coming tonight. He was casually dropping hints about the massive Sterling family legacy. I watched his smug face as he bragged about how Jessica was officially taking over the primary management of the family estate. He boldly told a senior partner that he and Jessica were preparing to move their primary residence to the $13 million family mansion by the end of the summer. He spoke about the massive sprawling property, the custom-built guest house, and the elite neighborhood as if he already held the deed in his own hands. He was using my stolen house to leverage his own corporate advancement and secure a faster track to senior partner. I watched them both completely intoxicated by their own fabricated wealth, and I felt the heavy manila folder resting inside my canvas tote bag under the table. Inside that folder was the global waiver my father expected me to sign, but tucked right behind it were the certified legal documents from Marcus Harrison. The real deed, the $50 million trust declaration, my grandmother's letter. I gripped the strap of my bag, feeling the immense, terrifying power of the truth resting right at my feet. They were all completely blind. At exactly 8:30, the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The main lights in the massive ballroom dimmed down to a soft atmospheric glow. A bright white spotlight suddenly illuminated the grand stage at the front of the room. The 350 guests fell completely silent, turning their attention to the front. My father, William, walked up the stairs to the stage, adjusting his custom tuxedo jacket with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on his face. He stepped up to the microphone, tapping it gently. The heavy thud echoed through the silent room. "Ladies and gentlemen," my father began, his deep, authoritative voice, commanding absolute respect from the elite crowd. "Family, friends, and esteemed colleagues, we are gathered here tonight in this historic, beautiful venue to celebrate an incredible milestone. For generations, the Sterling family has prided itself on excellence, on building a legacy of wealth, intelligence, and undeniable high society impact. Tonight, we celebrate the absolute pinnacle of that legacy." My father paused, looking down at Jessica, who was standing at the front edge of the stage, glowing in the spotlight. He smiled a warm, adoring smile that I had literally never once received in my entire 28 years of life. My daughter Jessica. He continued, his voice swelling with intense pride. "She has always been our shining star. She graduated in the top 5% of her class at Harvard Law. She has secured an incredible position at one of the most prestigious corporate firms in the country. She is brilliant, she is fierce, and she is exactly what the future of the Sterling brand represents." The ballroom erupted into massive, thunderous applause. Rich men in expensive suits clapped their hands enthusiastically, while women in diamond necklaces raised their champagne flutes in her direction. Jessica placed a delicate hand over her heart, bowing her head with perfect, calculated modesty. My father held up his hands, waiting for the applause to finally die down before he leaned back into the microphone. "But tonight is not just about celebrating Jessica's massive academic achievements," my father announced, his tone shifting into something far more serious and official. "Tonight marks a formal transition of power within our family. Catherine and I have decided that it is officially time to pass the torch. Effective immediately, Jessica and her brilliant husband Terence will be taking over the primary stewardship of the Sterling family assets. To mark this incredible occasion and to ensure they start their new high society lives with the proper foundation, Catherine and I are officially transferring the deed of our $13 million family estate entirely into Jessica's name." A collective gasp of absolute awe and admiration rippled through the wealthy crowd. Transferring a $13 million mansion as a graduation present was a display of wealth that even this elite group found incredibly staggering. "And because a new estate requires a proper vehicle," my father added with a massive grin, "we have a brand new custom Tesla Model S Plaid waiting for her in the valet garage right now." The crowd erupted again, cheering wildly for the golden child and her massive unearned inheritance. I sat in the dark back corner, my face perfectly blank, watching my father literally give away the house that I legally owned. He raised his hands once more, asking for quiet. The room settled down, waiting for his final remarks. "Now, as you all know, running an empire requires exceptional intellect and absolute relentless drive," my father said, his eyes scanning the massive crowd until they finally locked onto my dark corner in the very back of the room. A cruel, malicious smirk touched the corners of his mouth. "Not everyone in a family is equipped for that kind of elite pressure. Some people are just meant to be simple workers." He pointed directly at me, the bright spotlight catching the edge of my table. "My younger daughter, Harper, for instance. She works very hard at a local payroll desk. She's a very sweet girl, but let us just say she's going to have to log a lot of overtime hours, checking spreadsheets if she ever wants to keep up with her big sister." The entire ballroom erupted into laughter. 350 wealthy elite strangers turned around to look at the girl in the cheap navy dress sitting by the kitchen doors and laughed directly at my expense. It was a perfectly executed public humiliation designed to completely break my spirit right before I signed away my life. My father leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "Harper, why do you not come up here to the stage right now? I believe you have a special graduation gift you want to officially present to your sister." The laughter rolled through the massive grand ballroom like a physical wave of heat. 350 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city were staring directly at my dark corner, laughing at the pathetic payroll clerk in the cheap navy dress. Up on the brilliantly lit stage, my father William leaned against the microphone stand, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. He had delivered his punchline perfectly. He had secured his narrative, In his mind, he had successfully painted me as the slow, incapable disappointment who was about to publicly surrender whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left to her brilliant older sister. Beside him, Jessica stood draped in her glittering emerald silk gown, smiling a practiced, pitying smile that was designed to make her look like a benevolent queen tolerating a foolish peasant. Terence stood just behind them, nodding in arrogant approval with his wealthy corporate partners. They were waiting for me to stand up. They were waiting for me to walk down the long center aisle, clutching the global waiver they had forced upon me, ready to sign away my entire life and formally evict myself from the Sterling family legacy. I sat perfectly still at table 42. The junior law associates seated next to me were openly snickering, whispering cruel comments behind their champagne flutes. Just a few days ago, this exact scenario would have completely destroyed me. I would have collapsed under the crushing weight of their collective mockery. I would have believed every single terrible thing they thought about me. But tonight, the icy glacier in my veins kept my pulse perfectly steady. I did not feel small. I did not feel humiliated. I felt the immense, terrifying power of the secret I was about to unleash. I placed my hands flat on the rough tablecloth, preparing to push my chair back and make my long walk to the stage. I took a deep breath, letting the lingering laughter wash over me one final time. But before I could even move my chair, a loud, heavy sound echoed from the very back of the room. The massive brass doors of the ballroom suddenly swung open, hitting the wall stops with a sharp, authoritative crack that instantly cut through the noise of the crowd. The heavy oak doors were designed to remain shut during the main toasts, but now they stood wide open, spilling a harsh rectangular beam of hallway light directly into the dim, atmospheric glow of the ballroom. The laughter nearest the doors abruptly died down. Heads began to turn. Even my father squinted against the sudden glare shielding his eyes from the stage, trying to see who had dared to interrupt his grand, perfectly orchestrated performance. Standing in the center of the open doorway was a man who commanded absolute immediate respect. It was Marcus Harrison. He wore a flawlessly tailored dark charcoal suit that made the expensive tuxedos of the surrounding billionaires look cheap by comparison. His silver hair gleamed under the hallway lights, and his sharp, observant eyes scanned the massive room with the cold, clinical precision of a seasoned predator, evaluating a room full of prey. He did not look at the stage. He did not acknowledge the elite socialites or the powerful corporate attorneys who were staring at him in utter confusion. He carried a heavy leather briefcase in one hand, and he radiated an aura of immense, undeniable authority. Harrison began to walk. His footsteps were measured and deliberate. As he moved through the back of the room, a strange psychological phenomenon occurred. The wealthy elite guests, who had just been laughing at my expense, instinctively stepped aside to let him pass. They parted like the Red Sea, entirely unsure of who this man was, but completely unwilling to stand in his way. Then you know it. High society people possess a very specific radar for genuine power, and Marcus Harrison was currently projecting enough of it to silence the entire back half of the ballroom. I watched him approach, my heart beginning to hammer a fierce, victorious rhythm against my ribs. This was the exact moment we had meticulously planned in his downtown office. This was the precise detonation of the explosive charge we had buried under my parents' fraudulent empire. Up on the stage, my father cleared his throat, leaning back into the microphone, his voice tinged with sudden, unmistakable irritation. "Excuse me, sir." My father announced, his tone attempting to reassert his dominance over the room. "We are in the middle of a private family presentation. The service staff can assist you in the lobby." Harrison completely ignored him. He did not even flinch at the sound of my father's voice booming over the massive speakers. He kept his eyes locked entirely on my face as he navigated the final few feet through the crowded tables. The junior associates sitting next to me suddenly stopped sneering. They shrank back in their plush chairs, sensing the heavy, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Harrison reached table 42 and came to a complete stop right beside my chair. He looked down at me, his sharp features softening into an expression of profound respect. The entire ballroom was now deadly quiet. 350 people were watching this powerful, unknown stranger stand beside the disgraced payroll clerk. Harrison slowly set his heavy leather briefcase down on the floor. He reached into the inner pocket of his custom suit jacket and withdrew a thick, heavy manila envelope. The envelope was sealed tightly with a thick pool of dark red wax, bearing the official crest of his prestigious wealth management firm. It contained the certified property deed to the $13 million mansion, the $50 million trust declaration, and my grandmother's handwritten letter. It contained my absolute total freedom. He laid the heavy envelope delicately onto the table directly in front of me. The thick parchment landed with a soft defining thud that seemed to echo in the absolute silence of my corner. Then Harrison leaned down slightly, placing his hand gently on the back of my chair. The entire room strained to hear what was happening, but his voice was meant for my ears alone. "Now is the time to show them who you really are, Harper," he whispered, his deep voice vibrating with absolute certainty. I looked down at the red wax seal resting under the dim chandelier light. I thought about the 6 years I spent starving in a freezing studio apartment. I thought about my father's fake medical condition and the thousands of dollars I had desperately wired to save his life. I thought about the absolute cruelty of them using my own money to pay the property taxes on the house my grandmother had left solely to me. I placed my calloused hands on the edges of the envelope, feeling the thick, heavy reality of my inheritance. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I picked up the envelope, holding it firmly in my right hand. I did not look back at Harrison. I did not need to. I knew he was standing right behind me, ready to watch the slaughter unfold. I turned my body toward the brilliantly lit stage where my parents and my sister were staring at me in absolute paralyzed confusion. I took my first step out of the shadows and began the long walk down the center aisle, completely ready to burn their fraudulent world to ashes. I took my very first step out of the dark shadows of the back corner. The long center aisle of the Plaza Hotel Grand Ballroom stretched out before me like a massive glittering runway. 350 of the most powerful people in the city were watching my every single move. They fully expected me to keep my head bowed in shame. They expected the meek little payroll clerk in the cheap $45 navy dress to scurry up to the stage and publicly hand over the very last shred of her dignity. But my head was held perfectly high. My spine was forged from absolute steel. The heavy wax-sealed manila envelope resting in my right hand felt like a loaded weapon. Marcus Harrison walked exactly one pace behind my left shoulder. His presence was a silent, impenetrable shield of immense legal authority. As we moved deliberately past the lavishly decorated tables, the cruel laughter completely died away. The wealthy socialites and arrogant corporate partners felt the heavy, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. They parted for us. They pulled their plush velvet chairs in. They watched in absolute stunned silence as the girl they had just been openly mocking transformed into someone they did not recognize at all. Up on the brilliantly lit stage, my father William finally realized something was terribly wrong. His smug, victorious smile faltered and collapsed. His eyes darted from my calm expression to the tall, imposing figure of Marcus Harrison walking right behind me. William did not know Harrison personally, but a man obsessed with power and image always recognizes a significantly bigger predator when he sees one. My father gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles turning completely white. He took a sudden, aggressive step forward toward the edge of the stage, intending to intercept me before I could reach the velvet stairs. "Harper," he barked, his voice tight with sudden rising panic. "What exactly are you doing? Who is this man? Stop right there." I did not slow my pace even a fraction of an inch. I kept walking right up to the base of the stairs. William reached out his hand, attempting to physically block my path, but before his fingers could even graze my shoulder, Marcus Harrison stepped smoothly and decisively in front of me. He placed his tall frame directly between me and my father. Harrison did not raise his voice, but his tone carried the sharp, lethal edge of a guillotine blade swinging down. "Remove your hand from my client," Mr. Sterling Harrison commanded, echoing clearly through the front rows. "I am Marcus Harrison, Senior Managing Partner of Harrison and Associates, and the designated legal executor of the Evelyn Sterling estate. I am here in my official capacity to ensure my client exercises her absolute legal rights without your completely fraudulent interference." The word fraudulent hung in the air like a lit match in a powder keg. Terrence's senior law partners, who were seated at the prime tables closest to the stage, suddenly sat up perfectly straight. Their expressions shifted from bored amusement to intense professional alarm. My father physically recoiled, as if Harrison had struck him violently across the face. The healthy color drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He looked suddenly old and deeply terrified. Catherine, who had been standing proudly in the background, letting out a small strangled gasp, clutching her diamond necklace. I stepped around my paralyzed father and walked directly up the plush stairs onto the stage. Jessica was standing near the center in her glittering emerald silk gown. Her perfect, arrogant smile had completely vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated dread. She tried to step in my way to shield the microphone, but I simply looked right through her, as if she were made of glass. I walked straight up to the center stand. I did not snatch the microphone aggressively. I simply wrapped my hand around the metal stem and adjusted it to my exact height with a terrifying absolute calm. I looked out at the massive sea of elite faces. 350 people were holding their collective breath. The silence in the grand ballroom was so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing against the walls. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice steady and crystal clear, echoing flawlessly across the massive room. "My father just told you I was coming up here to deliver a graduation gift to my brilliant sister. He told you I was just a simple worker in the family, the one who needed to log overtime at the payroll desk just to keep up. For 6 years, I believed him. For 6 years, I worked 60 hours a week, eating instant rice and sleeping in a freezing, unheated studio apartment because my father called me sobbing, telling me his heart was failing. I gave them 60% of my meager income every single month because I loved my family and I desperately wanted to keep my father alive." A wave of confused, horrified murmurs rippled rapidly through the crowd. I saw several older women in the second row exchange shocked glances. "But my father does not have a heart condition." I continued, my voice cutting through the whispers like a diamond blade. "He is perfectly healthy. My parents just needed my blue-collar paycheck to secretly fund the massive property taxes on their $13 million estate because they are completely, entirely broke." William lunged forward, his face twisting with explosive rage. "Turn off her microphone," he screamed frantically at the sound technician in the back of the room. "Turn it off right now." But Harrison stepped forward, standing firmly at the edge of the stage, and pointed a single commanding finger at the tech booth, ensuring the sound remained perfectly live. The technician shrank back in his chair, leaving the channels wide open. I reached into my cheap canvas tote bag and pulled out my cell phone. "I told you I had a gift," I said, turning my head to look directly at Jessica and Terence, who were now frozen in absolute horror. "I brought exactly what you asked for." I held my phone directly up to the microphone, tapped the screen, and pressed play. The crisp, high-definition audio recording from their private study blasted through the massive ballroom speakers. Every single guest in the room heard my mother's voice dripping with pure elitist disgust, complaining about my broken-down car, and calling me a permanently flawed investment. The crowd gasped audibly. Then they heard Terence's smooth, arrogant drawl, boasting about how easily manipulated I was. The sound of his cruel laughter echoed through the Plaza Hotel as he called his own sister-in-law the family's free ATM. I watched the senior law partners at the front tables physically recoil in utter disgust. One of them slammed his champagne glass down and turned his back on Terence completely. Finally, the recording played my father's cold, calculating voice, outlining his exact malicious plan to formally evict me from their lives and block my number the very moment my money finished paying for this exact graduation party. The recording finished with the clinking of their expensive crystal glasses. I lowered my phone. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. It was the devastating sound of a generational dynasty completely evaporating in real time. Terence stood completely frozen on the stage, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. His entire high society corporate career had just been publicly executed by his own recorded words. Catherine sank to her knees right there on the stage, covering her face with her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. Jessica looked like she was going to be physically sick, her emerald gown suddenly looking like a ridiculous costume. But I was not finished. I placed my phone back into my bag and opened the heavy wax-sealed envelope I had carried down the aisle. I pulled out the crisp official legal documents and held them up high under the bright white stage lights. My parents called me into their study on Thursday night and demanded I sign a global waiver today. I announced, my voice ringing with total, absolute authority. They wanted me to stand on this stage and legally surrender my entire claim to the Sterling estate as a graduation present to Jessica. But they left out one tiny vital legal detail. You cannot surrender an estate that already legally belongs to you. I held up the certified property deed, turning it slowly so the front rows could see the official state seals. 3 years ago, my grandmother Evelyn passed away. My parents told everyone in this room that she died penniless and left everything to charity. They lied. My grandmother saw entirely through their toxic greed, and she left the $13 million mansion entirely to me. I am the sole legal owner of the house they currently live in. They suppressed her final will and kept me completely impoverished so I would unwittingly pay the massive property taxes on my own stolen house. They are illegally squatting in my property. The crowd erupted into chaotic shouting. Billionaires and socialites were staring at my father with absolute unmasked revulsion. William was leaning heavily against a decorative stage pillar, hyperventilating his face completely grey and sweating profusely. Then I pulled out the final piece of paper from the envelope, the certified bank check. And she did not just leave me the house. I continued raising my voice to cut through the incredible noise of the ballroom. She liquidated her entire massive portfolio and placed it into an ironclad blind trust to protect me from the exact financial abuse my parents just committed. I held the check up for the entire room to see the string of zeros printed boldly across the center. It is a certified bank check for exactly $50 million. I slowly lowered the check and turned my entire body to face my father. "You spent my entire life calling me the dumb one, William," I said, looking directly into his terrified, panicked eyes. "You convinced me I was permanently broken because I struggled to read when I was a little child. You weaponized my deep, desperate need for your love to turn me into your personal, indentured servant." But Grandma Evelyn knew the absolute truth. She left her entire $50 million empire to the dumb one. And as of this morning, every single credit line connected to your fraudulent holding company has been legally frozen by my attorney. You have absolutely nothing left. I looked at Jessica, who was weeping openly, her heavy designer makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "You wanted a grand public spectacle?" I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper that carried perfectly through the microphone. "You wanted a massive public passing of the torch. You wanted everyone in high society to see who truly controls the Sterling family legacy. Well, now they know." I stepped away from the microphone, leaving it standing in the center of the stage. I carefully placed the $50 million check and the property deed back into the heavy manila envelope. I did not look at them again. I walked calmly and deliberately down the plush stairs, Marcus Harrison waiting for me at the bottom with a look of immense, profound respect. As I walked back up the long center aisle of the grand ballroom, the crowd of wealthy elites did not laugh. They did not whisper cruel jokes. They parted silently in absolute awe, watching the true heir of the Sterling Empire walk out the front doors completely and utterly free. The silence in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was absolute and suffocating. I stood at the base of the plush stairs, with Marcus Harrison standing firmly beside me, like a sentinel. The echo of my voice over the microphone still seemed to vibrate through the massive crystal chandeliers above us. 350 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city were paralyzed. No one dared to take a sip of champagne. No one even coughed. They were all staring at the stage where my family was currently disintegrating in real time. My father, William, was gripping the decorative pillar as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth, his face a sickening shade of pale gray. My mother, Catherine, was on her knees weeping openly into her hands, her perfect makeup completely ruined. And then there was Terence. I turned my quiet gaze toward my arrogant brother-in-law. Just 10 minutes ago, Terence had been standing in the center of the room, holding a $1,000 glass of scotch, bragging loudly to the senior managing partners of his prestigious law firm. He had proudly boasted about moving into the $13 million family estate and taking over the Sterling legacy. Now the physical space around Terence was expanding rapidly. The incredibly wealthy elite corporate partners he had spent years desperately trying to impress were physically backing away from him. High society operates on a very strict unspoken code of conduct. They can tolerate arrogance and they can certainly tolerate greed, but they absolutely despise public humiliation and blatant financial fraud. I watched as the senior managing partner of Terence's firm, a formidable man with silver hair and a terrifyingly blank expression, set his champagne flute down on a passing waiter's silver tray. He did not say a single word, but he took two very deliberate steps backward, completely distancing himself from Terence. It was a silent but undeniable execution of Terence's entire corporate future. You could actually see the complex mechanical gears turning behind Terence's panicked eyes. He was a ruthless corporate attorney trained to analyze risk and mitigate massive disasters. He was rapidly running the terrible calculations in his head. He had married Jessica completely believing she was the sole heir to a massive multi-generational fortune. He had endured my parents' overbearing arrogance because he thought the ultimate payout was a $13 million mansion and an impenetrable high society brand. But now the brutal, undeniable truth had been broadcast to the entire room. There was no fortune. There was no legacy. His beautiful, sophisticated wife and his aristocratic in-laws were completely entirely broke. They were literal squatters, illegally occupying a house that actually belonged to the very sister-in-law they had spent years relentlessly mocking and exploiting. The audio recording of Terence himself laughing about bleeding me dry and calling me a free ATM had just been played for his bosses. He was legally tied to a family of absolute frauds who were about to face massive civil litigation for staggering property tax theft. The sheer panic radiating from his body was almost palpable. He looked at Jessica, who was standing near the center of the stage, shivering violently in her bespoke emerald silk gown. She looked toward him, her eyes wide with desperate pleading terror. She was waiting for her powerful, successful husband to step in and save her. She expected him to use his brilliant legal mind to fix the catastrophic damage and protect her from the humiliation. But Terence did not walk toward his wife. He did not offer her a comforting hand or a single reassuring word. Instead, his handsome face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated revulsion. Terence turned frantically toward the senior managing partner of his firm. His polished, arrogant demeanor completely shattered, leaving behind a desperate, scrambling man trying to save his own skin. "David," he started, his voice tight and unnaturally high. "David, you have to believe me. I had absolutely no idea about any of this. I was completely misled. I am a victim of their financial fraud just as much as anyone else in this room. I swear to you on my entire career, I thought the estate belonged to William. I never would have associated myself with this family if I had known they were committing this level of gross financial misconduct." The senior partner, David, looked at Terence with the cold, hard stare that could have frozen boiling water. "You stood in our offices and guaranteed the financial backing of the Sterling family." "Terence," David said, his voice low but carrying a terrifying weight, "you leveraged their supposed assets to secure your junior partnership. And yet we just listened to an audio recording of you actively conspiring to financially abuse a young woman to fund your own lifestyle. You're completely toxic, Terence. You are an absolute liability to our firm. Do not speak to me again." The senior partner turned his back and began walking toward the grand brass exit doors, followed immediately by the other elite lawyers in their circle. Terence watched his entire professional future walk out the door. The prestigious partnership, the massive bonuses, the elite status he had sacrificed everything to build, were entirely gone. He was instantly branded a pariah in the only social circle that mattered to him. The realization hit Terence with explosive, violent force. He whipped around to face the stage, his eyes locking onto my father. William was still leaning against the pillar, gasping for air. Terence marched right up to the base of the stairs, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my parents. "You absolute pathetic frauds!" Terence shouted, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom, completely shattering whatever tiny shred of decorum remained. "You lied to me. You stood in my home and looked me in the eye and promised me an empire. You let me bring my senior partners here tonight to witness a coronation for an estate you do not even own. You are squatters. You are broke, pathetic squatters living off the stolen wages of a payroll clerk." My father tried to stand up straight, raising a weak, trembling hand. "Terence, please." William stammered, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming authority. "We can fix this. We just need to manage the narrative. We can talk to Harper. We can figure out a legal arrangement." "Figure out an arrangement," Terence screamed, letting out a harsh, manic laugh. "There is no arrangement, William. She has a $50 million ironclad blind trust and the certified deed to your house. She owns you. You have absolutely nothing. You are completely bankrupt, and you have permanently destroyed my reputation in the process. I am a laughingstock because I married into a family of absolute con artists." Catherine sobbed louder, reaching out toward Terence from her place on the floor. "Terence, you are our son," she wept desperately. "We are family. You have to help us navigate this. We are family." Terence spat the word out as if it were a foul-tasting poison. "We are absolutely nothing. I am a respected corporate attorney, and you are common criminals. Do not ever refer to me as your son again." Then Terence's furious gaze shifted to Jessica. My sister was standing frozen in her glittering emerald gown, looking like a shattered porcelain doll. The heavy custom fabric suddenly looked ridiculous on her, hanging like a cheap costume on an actor who had forgotten all her lines. Terence Jessica cried out, her voice tiny and pathetic. "Terence, please do not do this. Please tell them we did not know. Please take me home so we can fix this." Terence looked her up and down, his expression radiating a disgust so pure and absolute it actually made me shiver. "Take you home," he sneered loudly, ensuring every single person in the remaining crowd could hear him perfectly. "To what home, Jessica?" "The luxury penthouse we leased based on your promised inheritance. The lifestyle I have been funding while waiting for your fraudulent father to pass the torch. You bring absolutely zero value to my life. You have no money, you have no estate, you are nothing but a broke, spoiled little girl wearing a stolen dress." Jessica physically recoiled, wrapping her arms around her stomach, as if he had literally punched her. Tears poured down her flawless makeup, completely ruining the high society aesthetic she spent hours perfecting. "Terence, please," she begged, dropping to her knees right there on the stage next to our mother. "I am your wife. I love you. You do not love me," Terence countered coldly, his voice dropping to a loud, terrifyingly calm register. "You loved the money you thought I could provide, while you waited for an inheritance that never actually existed. Well, the charade is completely over. I am not going down with this pathetic sinking ship. I refuse to let your massive fraudulent mess ruin my entire professional life." He turned away from her, completely dismissing her weeping form on the stage. He faced the remaining crowd of wealthy socialites, smoothing his expensive tie and adjusting his suit jacket. He raised his chin, attempting to salvage whatever tiny piece of his dignity he could. "Let the record show," Terence announced, his voice echoing clearly across the grand ballroom, "that I have absolutely zero association with the Sterling family, effective immediately. I will be contacting my personal legal counsel first thing Monday morning to formally file for an expedited divorce. I am completely dissolving this marriage to protect my own assets from their massive impending civil litigation." Jessica let out a loud, agonizing scream, burying her face in her hands. My father slumped down against the pillar, completely defeated. Terence did not even glance backward. He picked up his expensive phone from a nearby table, turned on his heel, and marched straight down the center aisle, heading directly for the massive brass doors. The crowd parted for him in complete silence, watching the ambitious corporate lawyer abandon his golden child wife without a single ounce of hesitation. I stood next to Marcos Harrison, watching Terence's retreating back until he completely disappeared into the grand lobby. The incredible, satisfying warmth of absolute justice flooded through my chest. The golden child was entirely broken, her precious marriage dissolved in a matter of seconds. The arrogant king and queen were humiliated, exposed, and completely bankrupt. I had not laid a single hand on them, but I had given them exactly enough rope to hang themselves in front of the entire world. The heavy brass doors had barely swung shut behind Terence when the absolute reality of the situation finally crashed down upon my parents. For a long, agonizing moment, the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel remained trapped in a suffocating, deathly silence. 350 of the most powerful elite socialites and corporate billionaires in the city simply stood frozen, holding their expensive champagne flutes and staring at the brilliantly lit stage. They were watching the complete and total destruction of the Sterling family dynasty broadcast live in real time. My mother, Catherine, was still crumpled on the floor of the stage, her perfectly tailored designer gown pulled around her knees. Her heavy, expensive mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, ugly, dark streaks, completely ruining the flawless aristocratic image she had spent her entire life desperately trying to cultivate. My father, William, was clutching the decorative wooden pillar on the stage, his knuckles completely white, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He stared at the empty space where his wealthy son-in-law had just been standing, his mind completely short-circuiting. He had spent his entire life manipulating, controlling, and dominating every single person in his orbit. He was a man who absolutely believed his own fabricated lies. But standing there utterly exposed in front of the very people he worshipped, he finally completely snapped. He pushed himself off the wooden pillar, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unhinged desperation. He lunged toward the edge of the stage, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly at me and Marcus Harrison. "This is a mistake," my father screamed, his voice cracking and echoing terribly through the massive live microphones still standing on the stage. "This is a massive fraudulent mistake. That deed is a forgery. My mother Evelyn would never ever leave this estate to her. She is sick, she is incompetent, and she is completely lying to all of you." He turned frantically to the silent crowd of wealthy elites, throwing his arms out in a desperate begging motion. "You all know me," William shouted, his voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. "You know my family. You know we are the true heirs to this legacy. This lawyer is an absolute con artist. He is trying to steal our home. He's trying to ruin my brilliant daughter's graduation. Please, someone call the authorities and have this pathetic, ungrateful girl physically removed from the premises immediately." No one in the glittering crowd moved a single muscle. No one reached for their phones. No one stepped forward to defend him. The elite billionaires and senior corporate partners simply looked at him with an icy, devastating brand of disgust. They had heard the clear, high-definition audio recording. They had heard his own voice, plotting to bleed me dry and cast me aside. They had seen the certified $50 million bank check and the official state property deed. High society respects power, and they absolutely despise pathetic public desperation. My father was drowning in front of them, and not a single one of his wealthy friends was willing to throw him a life preserver. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling an immense, terrifying sense of calm wash over my entire body. I was no longer the frightened little payroll clerk who cowered in the hallways of their $13 million mansion. I was the absolute master of the board, and it was time to sweep the remaining pieces into the trash. I took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between the floor and the stage. Harrison walked perfectly in sync with me, his heavy leather briefcase gripped firmly in his hand. He radiated a cold, impenetrable authority that made my father physically shrink backward as we approached. "William," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying clearly across the silent ballroom without the need for any microphone. "There is absolutely no mistake, and there is no forgery. You know exactly what my grandmother thought of your immense, toxic greed. You knew she saw right through your endless financial failures. You just never believed I would ever possess the intelligence or the courage to actually find the hidden trust documents you so desperately tried to suppress." Catherine let out a loud, dramatic wail from the floor, scrambling to her feet and stumbling toward the edge of the stage. "Harper, please," she begged, her voice thick with hysterical tears. "We are your parents. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You cannot do this to us. You cannot humiliate us in front of all our friends. Please just tell them it is a misunderstanding. We can go home right now and fix this as a family." I looked up at the woman who had spent my entire life calling me worthless. I looked at the mother who had forced me to wear ragged thrift store clothes while she paraded around in diamonds bought with my own starvation. "We are not going home to fix anything, Catherine," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "Because that house does not belong to you. It never belonged to you. You are completely, entirely broke, and you have been living a massive lie for the last 3 years." I held my hand out toward Marcus Harrison. He did not say a word. He simply popped the brass latches on his heavy leather briefcase, reached inside, and retrieved a crisp, white legal document. He placed it firmly into my outstretched hand. I walked directly up to the edge of the stage, where my father was standing paralyzed with fear. I reached up and pressed the crisp legal document firmly against his chest. His trembling hands reflexively came up to grab the paper. He stared down at the bold black lettering printed across the top of the page, his eyes widening in absolute unadulterated horror. "What is this?" My father choked out, his voice barely a terrified whisper. "That is a formal 24-hour eviction notice," I stated clearly, ensuring my voice carried to the front rows of the silent crowd. "Harrison and I filed it directly with the state courts this morning. Since you completely suppressed my grandmother's will and deliberately hid my legal ownership of the estate, you have been living in my $13 million mansion without a formal lease agreement. You have never paid rent. You have never held legal title. That makes you and Catherine tenants at will in my private home. And as the sole legal property owner, I am officially entirely revoking my permission for you to reside on my premises. The color completely drained from my father's face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out ghost. He stared at the eviction notice, his mouth opening and closing silently. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever cheap personal belongings you actually paid for with your own money. I continued, my tone completely devoid of any mercy. If you or Catherine are still inside the front gates of my property, by 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, Harrison has already coordinated with the local sheriff's department to have you physically dragged out of the mansion and formally arrested for criminal trespassing. You are going to be completely homeless by tomorrow night. Catherine let out another piercing, agonizing scream, collapsing back onto the stage floor and burying her face in her hands. My father just stood there, shaking uncontrollably, the eviction notice rattling in his hands, but I was not finished dismantling their world. I turned my attention to Jessica. My beautiful golden sister was standing completely frozen in her glittering emerald gown, looking absolutely destroyed. Her wealthy husband had just publicly abandoned her, her parents were being evicted, and her entire high society future had just evaporated into nothing but smoke. I slowly walked over to where Jessica was standing. She shrank back away from me, her eyes wide and terrified. She was clutching a small silver key fob in her trembling hands. It was the key to the brand new custom Tesla Model S Plaid my father had just so proudly announced as her ultimate graduation present. "Hand me the keys, Jessica," I commanded softly, holding out my open palm. Jessica stared at my hand, her lip quivering violently. "But Dad just gave it to me," she whispered, her voice cracking pathetically. "It is my graduation present, Harper. You cannot take my car." I did not move my hand. "Our father did not buy you that car, Jessica." I explained, my voice completely steady and brutally cold. He bought that custom Tesla using a massive fraudulent line of credit secured directly against the estate that he falsely claimed he owned. He used stolen leverage from my property to buy you a luxury vehicle to impress Terrence's law partners. That makes the vehicle entirely the legal property of the Evelyn Sterling Trust. It does not belong to you. It never belonged to you. Hand me the keys right now, or I will have Harrison add grand theft auto to the massive list of criminal charges we are filing against this family on Monday morning. Jessica let out a choked, humiliating sob. She looked at our father, begging for him to intervene, but William was completely broken, staring blankly at the floor. With a shaking, defeated hand, Jessica slowly reached out and dropped the silver key fob directly into my open palm. The heavy metal felt incredibly satisfying against my skin. The golden child was entirely stripped of her crown. I turned back to my parents for the final, absolute devastation. There was one last massive debt to settle. For 6 grueling years, I had worked brutal 60-hour overtime shifts at a miserable payroll desk. I had eaten instant rice for weeks at a time. I had lived in a freezing, tiny studio apartment with barely enough heat to survive the winter. I had done all of that because my father had called me sobbing, claiming his heart was failing, and he desperately needed money for experimental treatments. I had drained every single penny I ever earned to save his life, but his heart was perfectly fine. They had taken my blood, sweat, and tears and used it to secretly pay the massive property taxes on my own stolen mansion so they could continue throwing lavish dinner parties and pretending they were billionaires. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. "Over the last 6 years, I wired you exactly $200,000, William." I said, my voice slicing through the silent ballroom like a scalpel. "You told me it was for your failing heart. You begged me for it. You manipulated my love and you bled me completely dry. But you used every single penny of my payroll checks to pay the county property taxes on my estate because you were too broke to afford the maintenance on your own fraudulent lifestyle." William swallowed hard, backing away from me, his hands shaking violently. "Harper, please," he stammered defensively. "We had to protect the family image. We had to keep the house for Jessica's future. We were going to pay you back eventually. We just needed time." "You are out of time," I stated coldly, taking a step forward and backing him right up against the decorative pillar. "Harrison and I have officially and legally reclassified every single one of those desperate wire transfers. It is no longer a charitable gift from a daughter to her dying father. We have categorized it as a formal, heavily documented, outstanding loan. You legally stole $200,000 from the primary beneficiary of the Evelyn Sterling Trust to conceal massive property tax fraud. I leaned in close so only he could see the absolute terrifying promise burning in my eyes. But my voice was loud enough for the entire room to hear perfectly. You have exactly 30 days to repay the entire $200,000 balance in full. I told him, my tone vibrating with absolute finality. If you fail to produce every single penny by the deadline, Harrison has already prepared the massive legal dossier to hand directly to the district attorney. We have the bank records, we have the audio recordings, we have the forged trust documents. It is a textbook open and shut case of egregious financial fraud, wire fraud, and severe elder abuse for manipulating my grandmother's final assets. My father stared at me, his entire body trembling, his eyes wide with the absolute realization of his total destruction. "If you do not pay me back my money, William," I whispered, leaning incredibly close to his ear, "I promise you with every single fiber of my being that you and Catherine will spend your absolute golden years rotting away inside a federal prison cell. You will lose your freedom, your reputation, and everything you have ever valued." I stepped back, away from him, watching him physically crumble under the massive crushing weight of his own terrible consequences. He had absolutely no money. He had no credit. He had no wealthy friends left to bail him out. He was completely, entirely trapped. I looked at the three of them one last time. Catherine, sobbing on the floor, Jessica standing frozen without her husband or her inheritance, and William clutching an eviction notice that would make him completely homeless by tomorrow night. I had not laid a single violent hand on them. I simply gave them exactly what they had earned. I turned my back on my completely broken family and walked down the plush stage stairs. Marcus Harrison gave me a single respectful nod. I walked back up the long glittering center aisle of the Plaza Hotel ballroom, holding the deed to my mansion and the keys to my new car. The elite wealthy crowd parted for me in absolute stunned silence, watching the invisible ghost completely reclaim her entire kingdom. I pushed through the heavy brass doors, stepping out into the cool, crisp Manhattan night, finally, completely and utterly free. The heavy brass doors of the Plaza Hotel Grand Ballroom closed silently behind me, shutting out the toxic world I had endured for 28 years. But even from the grand lobby, I could completely picture the absolute desolation I had left in my wake. Marcus Harrison later told me exactly how the final moments of their glittering gala played out. After I walked away, the remaining high society guests did not linger. There were no sympathetic pats on the back. There were no whispered words of comfort. The elite billionaires and powerful corporate executives simply turned their backs and began a mass silent exodus. The string quartet packed up their instruments and slipped out the side doors. The caterers quietly began clearing the untouched caviar and expensive champagne. Within 15 minutes, the massive opulent ballroom was completely empty except for 3 shattered people. My father, William, was still frozen by the stage, clutching the 24-hour eviction notice like a death sentence. My mother, Catherine, remained crumpled on the floor, her designer gown ruined by her own hysterical tears. And my golden sister, Jessica, stood alone in the center of the room, her emerald silk dress looking like a pathetic costume, her wealthy husband already gone. They were entirely isolated in a massive gilded room that they could no longer afford to rent, surrounded by the echoing silence of their completely destroyed reputation. They had spent their entire lives treating me like absolute garbage to elevate themselves onto a pedestal. Now that pedestal was entirely reduced to dust, and they were the ones staring up from the bottom. Fast forward just a few incredibly short weeks, and the reality of their massive fraudulent collapse had completely set in. The 24-hour eviction notice I handed my father was not a bluff. By 8 o'clock the very next evening, Harrison had local sheriffs and deputies standing at the iron gates of my estate. William and Catherine were forced to pack their clothes into cheap cardboard boxes and walk out the front doors of my mansion for the very last time. They had absolutely zero access to credit lines. Their fraudulent holding company was completely locked down. They were entirely blacklisted from every single elite social circle in the city. With no massive bank accounts to hide behind, they were forced to rent a tiny, miserable one-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex near the industrial district. The contrast was absolutely staggering. Catherine, the woman who used to scream at florists if the imported roses were the wrong shade of white, was now living in a cramped space that constantly smelled of old cooking oil and damp mildew. There were no imported marble floors, just peeling linoleum and a dripping kitchen faucet. William, the arrogant patriarch, who loved to boast about his brilliant investments, was now spending his days sweating over massive legal files, desperately trying to figure out how to repay the $200,000 he legally owed me. He knew with absolute certainty that Harrison was counting down the 30 days. If William failed to produce the money, he was going entirely to federal prison for wire fraud and elder abuse. The sheer terror of orange jumpsuits and metal bars kept him awake every single night. They had traded a $13 million paradise for a miserable concrete box, all because they simply could not stop their own toxic greed. And then there was Jessica, my beautiful, brilliant sister who was supposed to inherit the entire world. Terence had not made an empty threat on that stage. He filed expedited divorce papers the very next Monday morning, completely severing all legal and financial ties to her. He claimed he was a victim of her family deception, and he locked her entirely out of his penthouse and his bank accounts. Jessica was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes in her closet and a Harvard law degree that was completely entirely useless. News travels incredibly fast in elite corporate circles. The audio recording of her sitting in that study, gleefully conspiring to steal my inheritance and laughing about my poverty, had completely destroyed her professional reputation. No prestigious law firm would ever risk the massive public relations nightmare of hiring her. The high society world she had been groomed to rule completely locked their doors and threw away the key. With no wealthy husband to fund her lifestyle and no parents to bail her out, Jessica was forced to face the brutal, unforgiving reality of the real world. Just a few weeks after standing on the stage at the Plaza Hotel, expecting a custom Tesla and a massive mansion, Jessica was forced to take a minimum wage job at a cheap retail clothing store in a local strip mall just to survive. The girl who used to complain about the exhausting pressures of being brilliant and beautiful was now spending 8 hours a day on her feet folding cheap polyester sweaters and sweeping up dusty fitting rooms. I heard from a former mutual acquaintance that she completely broke down sobbing in the break room when a rude customer yelled at her over a $20 return. She was finally experiencing the exact grueling, humiliating exhaustion she had so casually mocked me for enduring at the payroll desk. Karma had not just knocked on her door, it had kicked the door completely off its hinges. As for me, I finally moved into the master bedroom of the beautiful estate my grandmother Evelyn left me. I walked through the quiet, sunlit hallways feeling an incredible, profound sense of peace. I did not take their downfall as a malicious victory. I simply recognized it as the natural, unavoidable consequence of their own terrible choices. For 28 years, I believed I was the broken one. I believed that love meant shrinking yourself down until you were completely invisible just to make toxic people comfortable. I let them manipulate my empathy and drain my life savings because they told me that family requires endless sacrifice. But blood does not give anyone the right to exploit you. True family is not built on manipulation, fraud, and cruelty. It is perfectly acceptable to draw a hard line to protect your own peace and to let toxic people face the absolute destruction of their own making. Standing up for yourself is not causing drama. It is demanding basic human respect. I want to ask all of you watching this right now, have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members who tried to make you feel completely worthless? Have you ever realized that setting a boundary is not an act of revenge, but an act of pure survival? Please drop a comment down below and tell me your story. I read every single one of them. Let me know exactly where you are watching from today and what time it is there right now. If my journey resonated with you, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. Remember, you are never required to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. You deserve to walk in the light. Thank you so much for listening. Standing on the sweeping marble balcony of the $13 million estate, I watched the golden morning sunlight spill across the manicured lawns and the ancient oak trees. This was my kingdom now. The sheer quiet of the property was an absolute revelation. For 28 years, my life was defined by the chaotic, exhausting demands of people who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient human shield and an open wallet. Now the only sound was the gentle rustling of the leaves and the distant splashing of the custom stone fountain in the courtyard. I gripped the smooth stone railing, taking a deep, clean breath of the crisp morning air. I no longer smelled the stale, damp mildew of that freezing studio apartment. I no longer woke up with my heart pounding in absolute terror, wondering how I was going to afford my father's fake medical bills. The immense crushing weight of their manufactured crisis was entirely gone. I had finally excised the massive toxic tumor of my biological family, and the incredible relief was almost intoxicating. The very first thing I did on that Monday morning, after the spectacular Plaza Hotel collapse, was march directly into the dingy, cramped office of the payroll company. I did not give a 2-week notice. I simply placed my company badge on my manager's cluttered desk and walked right back out into the bright city sunlight. The girl who desperately logged 60-hour overtime shifts to buy her sister designer gowns was officially dead. In her place stood a woman who understood the exact value of her own analytical mind. Using a small fraction of the massive $50 million trust my grandmother Evelyn left me, I opened my very own boutique financial consulting firm in the heart of the financial district. The irony was absolutely exquisite. The daughter my parents relentlessly mocked and branded as the slow, incompetent failure was now managing massive investment portfolios for some of the most respected corporations in the city. The dumb one was officially running the board, and I was doing it entirely on my own terms without a single shred of the corrupt Sterling family influence. But building a massive corporate empire was never my true ultimate goal. Grandma Evelyn did not hide her fortune to turn me into another arrogant billionaire obsessed with high society status. She left me that money to break the cycle of generational cruelty. So I created the Evelyn Sterling Foundation. We actively fund massive comprehensive educational scholarships, specifically dedicated to children with severe reading delays and learning disabilities. We find the kids who are sitting in the very back of the classroom, the ones being told they are hopelessly broken or too slow to ever amount to anything. We provide them with the absolute best private tutors, the most advanced educational resources, and full-ride university scholarships. Every single time I sign a massive grant check to help a struggling child achieve their dreams, I think about my grandmother. I am taking the immense wealth my parents tried to steal for their own shallow vanity and weaponizing it to lift up the exact kind of children they would have mercilessly thrown away. It is not just philanthropy. It is absolute systemic justice. The massive $13 million mansion is no longer a dark, suffocating fortress of arrogance and psychological abuse. The heavy velvet drapes have been pulled back, letting the brilliant light pour into every single room. I do not host stuffy high society galas for elite billionaires who only care about my last name. Instead, my home is constantly filled with the warm, genuine laughter of my chosen family. Marcus Harrison drops by for Sunday dinners bringing his famous homemade lasagna. I am surrounded by incredibly brilliant, kind-hearted people who love me entirely for the woman I am, not the bank account I can provide. The hollow conditional love of my parents has been completely replaced by an absolute unshakable circle of loyalty. I am no longer a hidden ghost wandering the hallways of my own home. I am the absolute master of my own beautiful reality. I want to tell you something incredibly important right now. If you are sitting there listening to my story and feeling that deep, heavy ache of recognition in your chest, please know that you are not alone. Society relentlessly pushes this incredibly dangerous narrative that family is an absolute unbreakable bond and that you must constantly sacrifice your own mental health to protect the people who share your blood. But setting a firm boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is an absolute act of survival. True love should never ever be a transaction. You should never have to buy your place at the dinner table. You should never let anyone, not even your own parents, convince you that your entire worth is strictly tied to what you can provide for them. It took me 28 years of starvation, exhaustion, and emotional abuse to finally understand that I was never the broken one. I was just surrounded by people who needed me to stay small so they could feel big. If you have ever been underestimated, mocked, or used as a human ATM by your own toxic family, I see you. I completely understand the intense, agonizing pain of that betrayal. But I also know the incredible, absolute freedom waiting for you on the other side of that heavy door. Please, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue building this amazing supportive community together. Drop a comment down below and tell me exactly where you are watching from today and what time it is there right now. I read every single one of your comments, and I draw so much strength from your incredible stories. Until next time, please take care of yourself. Stand your ground, protect your peace, and always remember that you completely define your own absolute worth. Nobody else.